Chapter 4, Section 1 of Manual of Egyptian Archaeology and Guide to the Study of Antiquities in Egypt by Gaston Maspero, translated by Amelia B. Edwards. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Timothy Ferguson. Chapter 4, Painting and Sculpture. The statues and bas-reliefs which decorated the temples and tombs of ancient Egypt were, for the most part, painted. Coloured stones, such as granite, basalt, diorite, serpentine, and alabaster, sometimes escaped this law of polychrome, but in the case of sandstone, limestone, or wood, it was rigorously enforced. If sometimes we meet with uncoloured monuments in these materials, we may be sure that the paint has been accidentally rubbed off, or that the work is unfinished. The sculptor and the painter were, therefore, inseparably allied. The first had no sooner finished his share of the task than the other took it up, and the same artist was often as skilful a master of the brush as of the chisel. Section 1. Drawing and Composition. Of the system upon which drawing was taught by the Egyptian masters, we know nothing. They had learned from experience to determine the general proportions of the body, and the invariable relations of the various parts one with another. But they never troubled themselves to tabulate those proportions, or to reduce them to a system. Nothing in what remains to us of their works justifies the belief that they ever possessed a canon based upon the length of the human finger or foot. Theirs was a teaching of routine, and not of theory. Models executed by the master were copied over and over again by his pupils, till they could reproduce them with absolute exactness. That they also studied from life is shown by the facility with which they seized on a likeness, or rendered the characteristics and movements of different kinds of animals. They made their first attempts upon slabs of limestone, on drawing boards covered with a coat of red or white stucco, or on the backs of old manuscripts of no value. New papyrus was too dear to be spoiled by the scrawls of tyros. Having neither pencil nor stylus, they made use of the reed, the end of which, when steeped in water, opened out into small fibres, and made a more or less fine brush, according to the size of the stem. The palette was of thin wood, in shape a rectangular oblong, with a groove in which to lay the brush at the lower end. At the upper end were two or more cup-like hollows, each fitted with a cake of ink, black and red being the colours most in use. A tiny pestle and mortar for colour grinding, and a cup of water in which to clip and wash the brush, completed the apparatus of the student. Palette in hand, he squatted cross-legged before his copy, and without any kind of support for his wrist, endeavoured to reproduce the outline in black. The master looked over his work when done, and corrected the errors in red ink. The few designs which have come down to us are drawn on pieces of limestone, and are for the most part in sufficiently bad preservation. The British Museum possesses 2 or 3 subjects in red outline, which may perhaps have been used as copies by the decorators of some Theban tomb about the time of the 20th dynasty. A fragment in the Museum of Gizeh contains studies of ducks or geese in black ink, and at Turin may be seen a sketch of a half-nude female figure bending backwards as about to turn a somersault. The lines are flowing, the movement is graceful, the modelling delicate. The draughtsman was not hampered then, as now, by the rigidity of the instrument between his fingers. The reed brush attacked the surface perpendicularly, broadened, diminished, or prolonged the line at will, and stopped or turned with the utmost readiness. So supple a medium was admirably adapted to this rapid rendering of the humorous or ludicrous episodes of daily life. The Egyptians, naturally laughter-loving and satirical, were caricaturists from an early period. One of the Turin papyri chronicles the courtship of a shaven priest and a songstress of Amen in a series of spirited vignettes, while on the back of the same sheet are sketched various serio-comic scenes in which animals parody the pursuits of civilized man. An ass, a lion, a crocodile, and an ape are represented in the act of giving a vocal and instrumental concert. A lion and a gazelle play at draughts. The pharaoh of all the rats, in a chariot drawn by dogs, gallops to the assault of a fortress garrisoned by cats. A cat of fashion, with a flower on her head, has come to blows with a goose, and the hapless fowl, powerless in so unequal a contest, topples over with terror. Cats, by the way, were the favourite animals of Egyptian caricaturists. An ostracon in the New York Museum depicts a cat of rank en garde toilette seated in an easy chair, and a miserable Tom with piteous mane and tail between his legs, serving her with refreshments. Our catalogue of comic sketches is brief, but the abundance of pen drawings with which certain religious works were illustrated compensates for our poverty in secular subjects. These works are the Book of the Dead and the Book of Knowing That Which Is in Hades, which were reproduced by hundreds according to standard copies preserved in the temples or handed down through families, whose hereditary profession it was to conduct the services for the dead. When making these illustrations, the artist had no occasion to draw upon his imagination. He had but to imitate the copy as skilfully as he could. Of the Book of Knowing That Which Is in Hades, we have no examples earlier than the time of the 20th dynasty, and these are poor enough in point of workmanship, the figures being little better than dot and line forms, badly proportioned and hastily scrawled. The extant specimens of the Book of the Dead are so numerous that a history of the art of miniature painting in ancient Egypt might be compiled from this source alone. The earliest date from the 18th dynasty, the more recent being contemporary with the first Caesars. The oldest copies are for the most part remarkably fine in execution. Each chapter has a vignette representing a god in human or animal form, a sacred emblem, or the deceased in adoration before a divinity. These little subjects are sometimes ranged horizontally at the top of the text, which is written in vertical columns. Sometimes, like the illuminated capitals in our medieval manuscripts, they are scattered throughout the pages. At certain points, large subjects fill the space from the top to the bottom of the papyrus. The burial scene comes at the beginning, the judgment of the soul about the middle, and the arrival of the deceased in the fields of Alu at the end of the work. In these, the artist seized the opportunity to display his skill and show what he could do. We here see the mummy of Hunefer placed upright before his stela and his tomb. The women of his family bewail him, and the men and the priest present offerings. The papyri of the princes and princesses of the family of Pinatem in the Museum of Gizeh show that the best traditions of the art were yet in force at Thebes in the time of the 21st dynasty. Under the succeeding dynasties, that art fell into a rapid decadence, and during some centuries the drawings continued to be coarse and valueless. The collapse of the Persian rule produced a period of renaissance. Tombs of the Greek time have yielded papyri with vignettes carefully executed in a dry and minute style, which offers a singular contrast to the breadth and boldness of the Pharaonic ages. The broad-tipped reed pen was thrown aside for the pen with a fine point, and the scribes vied with each other as to which should trace the most attenuated lines. The details with which they overlooked their figures, the elaboration of the beard and the hair and the folds of the garments, are sometimes so minute that it is scarcely possible to distinguish them without a magnifying glass. Precious as these documents are, they give a very insufficient idea of the ability and technical methods of the artists of ancient Egypt. It is to the walls of their temples and tombs that we must turn if we desire to study their principles of composition. Their conventional system differed materially from our own. Man or beast, the subject was never anything but a profile relieved against a flat background. Their object, therefore, was to select forms which presented a characteristic outline capable of being reproduced in pure line upon a plane surface. As regarded animal life, the problem was in no wise complicated. The profile of the back and the body, the head and the neck, carried in undulating lines parallel with the ground, were outlined at one sweep of the pencil. The legs also are well detached from the body. The animals themselves are lifelike, each with the gait and action and flexion of the limbs peculiar to its species, the slow and measured tread of the ox, the short step, the meditative ear, the ironical mouth of the ass, the abrupt little trot of the goat, the spring of the hunting greyhound, are all rendered with invariable success of outline and expression. Turning from domestic animals to wild beasts, the perfection of treatment is the same. The calm strength of the lion in repose, the stealthy and sleepy tread of the leopard, the grimace of the ape, the slender grace of the gazelle and the antelope have never been better expressed than in Egypt. But it was not so easy to project man, the whole man, upon a plane surface without some departure from nature. A man cannot be satisfactorily reproduced by means of mere lines, and a profile outline necessarily excludes too much of his person. The form of the forehead and the nose, the curvature of the lips, the cut of the ear, disappear when the head is drawn full face, but, on the other hand, it is necessary that the bust should be presented full face in order to give the full development of the shoulders, and that the two arms may be visible to the right and left of the body. The contours of the trunk are best modelled in a three-quarters view, whereas the legs show to most advantage when seen sideways. The Egyptians did not hesitate to combine these contradictory points of view in one single figure. The head is almost always given in profile, but is provided with a full-face eye and placed upon a full-face bust. The full-face bust adorns a trunk seen from a three-quarters point of view, and the trunk is supported upon legs depicted in profile. Very seldom do we meet with figures treated according to our own rules of perspective. Most of the minor personages represented in the tomb of Khnum-hotep seem, however, to have made an effort to emancipate themselves from the law of malformation. Their bodies are given in profile, as well as their heads and legs, but they thrust forward first one shoulder and then the other in order to show both arms, and the effect is not happy. Yet, if we examine the treatment of the farm servant who is cramming a goose, and above all, the figure of the standing man who throws his weight upon the neck of a gazelle to make it kneel down, we shall see that the action of the arms and hips is correctly rendered, that the form of the back is quite right, and that the prominence of the chest, thrown forward in proportion as the shoulders and arms are thrown back, is drawn without any exaggeration. The wrestlers of the Beni Hassan tombs, the dancers and servants of the Theban catacombs, attack, struggle, posture, and go about their work with perfect naturalness and ease. These, however, are exceptions. Tradition, as a rule, was stronger than nature, and, to the end of the chapter, the Egyptian masters continued to deform the human figure. The men and women are actual monsters from the point of view of the anatomist, and yet, after all, they are neither so ugly nor so ridiculous as might be supposed by those who have only seen the wretched copies so often made by our own modern artists. The wrong parts are joined to the right parts with so much skill that they seem to have grown there. The natural lines and the fictitious lines follow and complement each other so ingeniously that the former appear to give rise of necessity to the latter. The conventionalities of Egyptian art once accepted, we cannot sufficiently admire the technical skill displayed by the draughtsman. His line was pure, firm, boldly begun, and as boldly prolonged. 10 or 12 strokes of the brush sufficed to outline a figure the size of life. The whole head, from the nape of the neck to the rise of the throat above the collarbone, was executed at one sweep. 2 long undulating lines gave the external contour of the body from the armpits to the ends of the feet. 2 more determined the outlines of the legs and the arms. The detail of costume and ornaments, at first but summarily indicated, were afterwards taken up one by one and minutely finished. We may almost count the locks of the hair, the plaits of the linen, the inlayings of the girdles and bracelets. This mixture of artless science and intentional awkwardness, of rapid execution and patient finish, excludes neither elegance of form, nor grace of attitude, nor truth of movement. These personages are of strange aspect, but they live, and to those who will take the trouble to look at them without prejudice, their very strangeness has a charm about it which is often lacking to works more recent in date and more strictly true to nature. We admit, then, that the Egyptians could draw. Were they, as it has been oftentimes asserted, ignorant of the art of composition? We shall take a scene at hazard from a Theban tomb, the scene which represents the funerary repast offered to Prince Horemheb by the members of his family. The subject is half ideal, half real. The dead man and those belonging to him who are no longer of this world are depicted in the society of the living. They are present yet aloof. They assist at the banquet, but do not actually take part in it. Horemheb sits on a folding stool to the left of the spectator. He dandles on his knee a little princess, daughter of Amenhotep III, whose foster father he was, and who died before him. His mother, Suit, sits to his right hand a little way behind, enthroned in a large chair. She holds his arm with her left hand, and with the right she offers him a lotus blossom and bud. A tiny gazelle, which was probably buried with her, like the pet gazelle discovered beside Queen Isiemkheb in the hiding place at Deir el Bahri, is tied to one of the legs of the chair. This ghostly group is of heroic size, the rule being that gods are bigger than men, kings bigger than their subjects, and the dead bigger than the living. Horemheb, his mother, and the women standing before them occupy the front level or foreground. The relations and friends are ranged in line facing their deceased ancestors, and appear to be talking one with another. The feast has begun. The jars of wine and beer, placed in rows upon wooden stands, are already unsealed. Two young slaves rub the hands and necks of the living guests with perfumes taken from an alabaster vase. Two women, dressed in robes of ceremony, present offerings to the group of dead, consisting of vases filled with flowers, perfumes, and grain. These they place in turn upon a square table. Three others dance, sing, and play upon the lute, by way of accompaniment to those acts of homage. In the picture, as in fact, the tomb is the place of entertainment. There is no other background to the scene than the wall covered with hieroglyphs, along which the guests were seated during the ceremony. Elsewhere, the scene of action, if in the open country, is distinctly indicated by trees and tufts of grass, by red sand if in the desert, and by a maze of reeds and lotus plants if in the marshes. A lady of quality comes in from a walk. One of her daughters, being athirst, takes a long draught from a gullah. Two little naked children with shaven heads, a boy and a girl, run to meet their mother at the gate, are made happy with toys brought home and handed to them by a servant. A trellised enclosure covered with vines and trees laden with fruit are shown above. Yonder, therefore, is the garden, but the lady and her daughters have passed through it without stopping, and are now indoors. The front of the house is half put in and half left out, so that we may observe what is going on inside. We accordingly see three attendants hastening to serve their mistresses with refreshments. The picture is not badly composed, and would need but little alteration if transferred to a modern canvas. The same old awkwardness, or rather the same old obstinate custom, which compelled the Egyptian artist to put a profile head upon a full-face bust, has, however, prevented him from placing his middle distance and background behind his foreground. He has, therefore, been reduced to adopt certain more or less ingenious contrivances, in order to make up for an almost complete absence of perspective. Again, when a number of persons engaged in the simultaneous performance of any given act were represented on the same level, they were isolated as much as possible, so that each man's profile might not cover that of his neighbour. When this was not done, they were arranged to overlap each other, and thus, despite the fact that all stood on the one level, so that they have actually but two dimensions and no thickness, a herdsman walking in the midst of his oxen plants his feet upon precisely the same ground line as the beast which interposes between his body and the spectator. The most distant soldier of a company which advances in good marching order to the sound of the trumpet has his head and feet on exactly the same level as the head and feet of the foremost among his comrades. When a squadron of chariots defiles before the Pharaoh, one would declare that their wheels all ran in the selfsame ruts, were it not that the body of the first chariot partially hides the horse by which the second chariot is drawn. In these examples, the people and objects are, either accidentally or naturally, placed so near together that the anomaly does not strike one as too glaring. In taking these liberties, the Egyptian artist but anticipated a contrivance adopted by the Greek sculptor of a later age. Elsewhere, the Egyptian has occasionally approached nearer to the truth of treatment. The archers of Ramesses III at Medinet Habu made an effort, which is almost successful, to present themselves in perspective. The row of helmets slopes downwards, and the row of bows slopes upwards, with praiseworthy regularity, but the men's feet are all on the same level, and do not, therefore, follow the direction of the other lines. This mode of representation is not uncommon during the Theban period. It was generally adopted when men or animals ranged in line had to be shown in the act of doing the same thing, but it was subject to the grave drawback, or what was in the Egyptian eyes the grave drawback, of showing the body of the first man only, and of almost entirely hiding the rest of the figures. When, therefore, it was found impossible to range all upon the same level without hiding some of their number, the artist frequently broke his masses up into groups, and placed one above the other on the same vertical plane. Their height in no wise depends on the place they occupy in the perspective of the tableau, but only upon the number of rows required by the artist to carry out his idea. If 2 rows of figures are sufficient, he divides his space horizontally into equal parts. If he requires 3 rows, he divides it into 3 parts, and so on. When, however, it is a question of mere accessories, they are made out on a smaller scale. Secondary scenes are generally separated by a horizontal line, but this line is not indispensable. When masses of figures formed in regular order had to be shown, the vertical planes lapped over, so to speak, according to the caprice of the limner. At the Battle of Kadesh, the files of Egyptian infantry rise man above man, waist high, from top to bottom of the phalanx, while those of the Kheta or Hittite battalions show but one head above another. It was not only in their treatment of men and animals that the Egyptians allowed themselves this latitude. Houses, trees, land, and water were as freely misrepresented. An oblong rectangle placed upright or on its side and covered with regular zigzags represents a canal. Lest one should be in doubt as to its meaning, fishes and crocodiles are put in to show that it is water and nothing but water. Boats are seen floating upright upon this edgewise surface. The flocks ford it where it is shallow, and the angler with his line marks the spot where the water ends and the bank begins. Sometimes the rectangle is seen suspended like a framed picture, about halfway of the height of several palm trees, whereby we are given to understand a tank bordered on both sides by trees. Sometimes again, as in the tomb of Rekhmara, the trees are laid down in rows round the four sides of a square pond, while a profile boat, conveying a dead man in his shrine, hauled by slaves, also shown in profile, floats on the vertical surface of the water. The Theban catacombs of the Ramesside period supply abundant examples of contrivances of this kind, and having noted them, we end by not knowing which most to wonder at: the obstinacy of the Egyptians in not seeking to discover the natural laws of perspective, or the inexhaustible wealth of resources which enabled them to invent so many false relations between the various parts of their subjects. When employed upon a very large scale, their methods of composition shock the eye less than when applied to small subjects. We instinctively feel that even the ablest artist must sometimes have played fast and loose with the laws of perspective, if tasked to cover the enormous surfaces of pyramid pylons. Hence the unities of the subject are never strictly observed in these enormous bas-reliefs. The main object being to perpetuate the memory of a victorious pharaoh, that pharaoh necessarily plays the leading part, but instead of selecting from among his striking deeds some one leading episode preeminently calculated to illustrate his greatness, the Egyptian artist delighted to present the successive incidents of his campaign at a single coup d'oeil. Thus treated, the pylons of Luxor and the Ramesseum show a Syrian night attack upon the Egyptian camp, a seizure of spies sent by the prince of the Kheta for the express purpose of being caught and giving false intelligence of his movements, the king's household troops surprised and broken by the Khetan chariots, the battle of Kadesh and its various incidents, so furnishing us, as it were, with a series of illustrated dispatches of the Syrian campaign undertaken by Rameses II in the 5th year of his reign. After this fashion precisely did the painters of the earliest Italian schools depict within the one field, and in one uninterrupted sequence, the several episodes of a single narrative. The scenes are irregularly dispersed over the surface of the wall without any marked lines of separation, and, as with the bas-reliefs upon the column of Trajan, one is often in danger of dividing the groups in the wrong place, and of confusing the characters. This method is reserved almost exclusively for official art. In the interior decoration of temples and tombs, the various parts of the one subject are distributed in rows ranged one above the other, from the ground line to the cornice. Thus another difficulty is added to the number of those which prevent us from understanding the style and intention of Egyptian design. We often imagine that we are looking at a series of isolated scenes, when in fact we have before our eyes the disjecta membra of a single composition. Take, for example, one wall side of the tomb of Ptah-hotep at Saqqara. If we would discover the link which divides these separate scenes, we shall do well to compare this wall subject with the mosaic at Palestrina, a monument of Greco-Roman time, which represents almost the same scenes, grouped, however, after a style more familiar to our ways of seeing and thinking. The Nile occupies the immediate foreground of the picture, and extends as far as the foot of the mountains in the distance. Towns rise from the water's edge, and not only towns, but obelisks, farmhouses, and towers of Greco-Italian style, more like the buildings depicted in Pompeian landscapes than the monuments of the pharaohs. Of these buildings, only the large temple in the middle distance to the right of the picture, with its pylon gateway and 4 Assyrian colossi, recalls the general arrangement of Egyptian architecture. To the left, a party of sportsmen in a large boat are seen in the act of harpooning the hippopotamus and crocodile. To the right, a group of legionaries, drawn up in front of the temple and preceded by a priest, salute a passing galley. Towards the middle of the foreground, in the shade of an arched trellis thrown across a small branch of the Nile, some half-clad men and women are singing and carousing. Little papyrus skiffs, each rowed by a single boatman, and other vessels, fill the vacant spaces of the composition. Behind the buildings we see the commencement of the desert. The water forms large pools at the base of the overhanging hills, and various animals, real or imaginary, are pursued by shaven-headed hunters in the upper part of the picture. Now, precisely after the manner of the Roman mosaicist, the Egyptian artist placed himself, as it were, on the Nile, and reproduced all that lay between his own standpoint and the horizon. In the wall painting, the river flows along the line next the floor. Boats come and go, and boatmen fall to blows with punting poles and gaffs. In the division next above, we see the river bank and the adjoining flats, where a party of slaves, hidden in the long grasses, trap and catch birds. Higher still, boat making, rope making, and fish curing are going on. Finally, in the highest register of all, next the ceiling, are depicted the barren hills and undulating plains of the desert, where greyhounds chase the gazelle, and hunters trammel big game with the lasso. Each longitudinal section corresponds, in fact, with a plane of the landscape, but the artist, instead of placing his planes in perspective, has treated them separately, and placed them one above the other. We find the same disposition of the parts in all Egyptian tomb paintings. Scenes of inundation and civil life are ranged along the base of the wall, mountain subjects and hunting scenes being invariably placed high up. Sometimes interposed between these two extremes, the artist has introduced subjects dealing with the pursuits of the herdsman, the field labourer, and the craftsman. Elsewhere he suppresses these intermediary episodes, and passes abruptly from the watery to the sandy region. Thus the mosaic of Palestrina and the tomb-like paintings of Pharaonic Egypt reproduce the same group of subjects, treated after the conventional styles and methods of two different schools of art. Like the mosaic, the wall scenes of the tomb formed not a series of independent scenes, but an ordinary composition, the utility of which is readily recognised by such as are skilled to read the art language of the period. End of Chapter 4, Section 1. Recording by Timothy Ferguson, Gold Coast, Australia. Chapter 4, Section 2 of Manual of Egyptian Archaeology and Guide to the Study of Antiquities in Egypt by Gaston Maspero. Translated by Amelia B. Edwards. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Timothy Ferguson. Chapter 4, Painting and Sculpture. Section 2, Technical Processes. The preparation of the surface about to be decorated demanded much time and care. Seeing how imperfect were the methods of construction, and how impossible it was for the architect to ensure a perfectly level surface for the facing stones of his temple walls and pylons, the decorator had perforce to accommodate himself to a surface slightly rounded in some places and slightly hollowed in others. Even the blocks of which it was formed were scarcely homogeneous in texture. The limestone strata in which the Theban catacombs were excavated were almost always interposed with flint nodules, fossils, and petrified shells. These faults were variously remedied according as the decoration was to be sculpted or painted. If painted, the wall was first roughly levelled, and then overlaid with a coat of black clay and chopped straw, similar to the mixture used for brick making. If sculptured, then the artist had to arrange his subject so as to avoid the inequalities of the stone as much as possible. When these occurred in the midst of the figure subjects, and if they did not offer too stubborn a resistance to the chisel, they were simply worked over. Otherwise, the piece was cut out and a new piece fitted in, or the hole was filled up with white cement. This mending process was no trifling matter. We could point to tomb chambers where every wall is thus inlaid to the extent of 1/4 of its surface. The preliminary work being done, the whole was covered with a thin coat of fine plaster mixed with white of egg, which hid the mudwash or the piecing, and prepared a level and polished surface for the pencil of the artist. In chambers, or parts of chambers which have been left unfinished, and even in the quarries, we constantly find sketches of intended bas-reliefs, outlined in red or black ink. The copy was generally executed upon a small scale, then squared off and transferred to the wall by the pupils and assistants of the master. As in certain scenes carefully copied by Priss from the walls of Theban tombs, the subject is occasionally indicated by only 2 or 3 rapid strokes of the reed. Elsewhere the outline is fully made out, and the figures only await the arrival of the sculptor. Some designers took pains to determine the position of the shoulders and the centre of gravity of the bodies by vertical and horizontal lines, upon which, by means of a dot, they noted the height of the knee, the hips, and other parts. Others again, more self-reliant, attacked their subject at once, and drew in the figures without the aid of guiding points. Such were the artists who decorated the catacomb of Seti I. and the southern walls of the temple of Abydos. Their outlines are so firm, and their faculty is so surprising, that they have been suspected of stenciling. But no one who has closely examined their figures, or who has taken the trouble to measure them with a compass, can maintain that opinion. The forms of some are slighter than the forms of others, while in some the contours of the chest are more accentuated, and the legs further apart, than in others. The master had little to correct in the work of these subordinates. Here and there he made a head more erect, accentuated or modified the outline of a knee, or improved some detail of arrangement. In one instance, however, at Komombo, on the ceiling of a Greco-Roman portico, some of the divinities had been falsely orientated, their feet being placed where their arms should have been. The master consequently outlined them afresh, and on the same squared surface, without effacing the first drawing. Here, at all events, the mistake was discovered in time. At Karnak, on the north wall of the hypostyle hall, and again at Medinet Habu, the faults of the original design were not noticed till the sculptor had finished his part of the work. The figures of Seti I. and Rameses III. were thrown too far back, and threatened to overbalance themselves, so they were smoothed over with cement and cut anew. Now the cement is flaked off, and the work of the first chisel is exposed to view. Seti and Rameses III. have two profiles, the one very lightly marked, the other boldly cut into the surface of the stone. The sculptors of ancient Egypt were not so well equipped as those of our own day. A kneeling scribe in limestone at the Gizeh Museum has been carved with the chisel, the grooves left by the tool being visible on his skin. A statue in grey serpentine in the same collection bears traces of the use of two different tools, the body being spotted all over with point marks, and the unfinished head being blocked out splinter by splinter with a small hammer. Similar observations, and the study of the monuments, show that the drill, the toothed chisel, and the gouge were also employed. There have been endless discussions as to whether these tools were of iron or bronze. Iron, it is argued, was deemed impure. No one could make use of it, even for the basest needs of daily life, without incurring a taint prejudicial to the soul both in this world and the next. But the impurity of any given object never sufficed to prevent the employment of it when required. Pigs also were impure, yet the Egyptians bred them. They bred them, indeed, so abundantly in certain districts, that our worthy Herodotus tells us how the swine were turned into the fields after seed sowing, in order that they might tread the grain. So also iron, like many other things in Egypt, was pure or impure according to circumstances. If some traditions held it up in odium as an evil thing and stigmatized as the bones of Typhon, other traditions equally venerable affirmed that it was the very substance of the canopy of heaven. So authoritative was this view, that iron was currently known as Ba-en-Pet, or the celestial metal. The only fragment of metal found in the Great Pyramid is a piece of plate iron, and if ancient iron objects are nowadays of exceptional rarity as compared with ancient bronze objects, it is because iron differs from bronze, inasmuch as it is not protected from destruction by its oxide. Rust speedily devours it, and it needs a rare combination of favourable circumstances to preserve it intact. If, however, it is quite certain that the Egyptians were acquainted with, and made use of, iron, it is no less certain that they were wholly unacquainted with steel. This being the case, one asks how they can possibly have dealt at will upon the hardest rocks, even upon such as we ourselves hesitate to attack, namely diorite, basalt, and the granite of Cyrene. The manufacturers of Antiquities, who sculpture granite for the benefit of tourists, have found a simple solution of this problem. They work with some 20 common iron chisels at hand, which after a few turns are good for nothing. When one is blunted, they take up another, and so on till their stock is exhausted. Then they go to the forge and put their tools into working order again. This process is neither so long nor so difficult as might be supposed. In the Gizeh Museum is a life-sized head produced from a block of black and red granite in less than a fortnight by one of the best forgers in Luxor. I have no doubt that the ancient Egyptians worked in precisely the same way, and mastered the hardest stones by the use of iron. Practice soon taught them the methods by which their labour might be lightened, and their tools made to yield results as delicate and subtle as those which we achieve with our own. As soon as the learner knew how to manage the point and the mallet, his master set him to copy a series of graduated models, representing an animal in various stages of completion, or a part of the human body, or the whole human body, from the first rough sketch to the finished design. Each year these models are found in sufficient number to establish examples of progressive series. Apart from isolated specimens which are picked up everywhere, the Gizeh collection contains a set of 15 from Saqqara, 41 from Tanis, and a dozen from Thebes and Medinet Habu. They were intended partly for the study of bas reliefs, partly for the study of sculpture proper, and they reveal the method in use for both. The Egyptians treated bas relief in three ways: either as a simple engraving executed by means of incised lines, or by cutting away the surface of the stone around the figure, and so causing it to stand out in relief upon the wall, or by sinking the design below the wall surface and cutting it in relief at the bottom of the hollow. The first method has the advantage of being expeditious, and the disadvantage of not being sufficiently decorative. Rameses III made use of it in certain parts of his temple at Medinet Habu, but as a rule it was preferred for stelae and small monuments. The last named method lessened not only the danger of damage to the work, but the labour of the workman. It evaded the dressing down of the background, which was a distinct economy of time, and it left no projecting work on the surface of the walls, the design being thus sheltered from accidental blows. The intermediate process was, however, generally adopted, and appears to have been taught in the schools by preference. The models were little rectangular tablets squared off in order that the scholar might enlarge or reduce the scale of his subject without departing from the traditional proportions. Some of these models are wrought on both sides, but the greater number are sculptured on one side only. Sometimes the design represents a bull, sometimes the head of a cynocephalous ape, of a ram, of a lion, of a divinity. Occasionally we find the subject in duplicate, side by side, being roughly blocked out to the left, and highly finished to the right. In no instance does the relief exceed 1/4 inch, and it is generally even less. Not but that the Egyptians sometimes cut boldly into stone. At Medinet Habu and Karnak, on the higher parts of these temples, where the work is in granite or sandstone, and exposed to full daylight, the bas relief decoration projects full 6 3/8 inches above the surface. Had it been lower, the tableau would have been, as it were, absorbed by the flood of light poured upon them, and the eye of the spectator would have been presented only a confused network of lines. The models designed for the study of the round are even more instructive than the rest. Some which have come down to us are plaster casts of familiar subjects. The head, the arms, the legs, the trunk, each part of the body, in short, was separately cast. If a complete figure were wanted, the disjecta membra were put together, and the result was a statue of a man or of a woman, kneeling, standing, seated, squatting, the arms extended or falling passively by the sides. This curious collection was discovered at Tanis, and dates probably from Ptolemaic times. Models of the Pharaonic ages are in soft limestone, and nearly all represent portraits of reigning sovereigns. These are best described as cubes measuring about 10 inches each way. The work was begun by covering one face of the cube with a network of lines crossing each other at right angles. These regulated the relative position of the features. Then the opposite side was attacked, the distances being taken from the scale on the reverse face. A mere oval was designed on this first block, a projection in the middle, and a depression to the right and left vaguely indicating the whereabouts of nose and eyes. The forms become more definite as we pass from cube to cube, and the face emerges by degrees. The limit of the contours is marked off by parallel lines cut vertically from top to bottom. The angles were next cut away and smoothed down, so as to bring out the forms. Gradually the features become disengaged from the block, the eye looks out, the nose gains refinement, the mouth is developed. When the last cube is reached, there remains nothing to finish save the details of the headdress and the basilisk on the brow. No scholar's model in basalt has yet been found, but the Egyptians, like our monumental masons, always kept stock of half-finished statues in hard stone, which could be turned out complete in a few hours. The hands, feet, and bust needed only a few last touches, but the heads were merely blocked out, and the clothing left in the rough. Half a day's work then sufficed to transform the face into a portrait of the purchaser, and to give the last new fashion to the kilt. The discovery of some 2 or 3 statues of this kind has shown us as much of the process as a series of teachers' models might have done. Volcanic rocks could not be cut with the continuity and regularity of limestone. The point only could make any impression upon these obdurate materials. When, by force of time and patience, the work had thus been finished to the degree required, there would often remain some little irregularities of surface, due, for example, to the presence of nodules and heterogeneous substances, which the sculptor had not ventured to attack, for fear of splitting away part of the surrounding surface. In order to remove these irregularities, another tool was employed, namely a stone cut in the form of an axe. Applying the sharp edge of this instrument to the projecting nodule, the artist struck it with a round stone in place of a mallet. A succession of carefully calculated blows with these rude tools pulverized the obtrusive knob, which disappeared in dust. All minor defects being corrected, the monument still looked dull and unfinished. It was necessary to polish it, in order to efface the scars of point and mallet. This was a most delicate operation, one slip of the hand or a moment's forgetfulness being enough to ruin the labour of many weeks. The dexterity of the Egyptian craftsmen was, however, so great that accidents rarely happened. The Sebekemsaf of Gizeh, the colossal Rameses II of Luxor, challenge the closest examination. The play of light upon the surface may at first prevent the eye from apprehending the fineness of the work, but seen under favourable circumstances, the details of knee and chest, of shoulder and face, prove to be no less subtly rendered in granite than in limestone. Excess of polish has no more spoiled the statues of ancient Egypt than it spoiled those of the sculptors of the Italian Renaissance. A sandstone or limestone statue would have been deemed imperfect if left to show the colour of the stone in which it was cut, and was painted from head to foot. In bas-relief, the background was left untouched, and only the figures were coloured. The Egyptians had more pigments at their disposal than is commonly supposed. The more ancient painters' palettes, and we have some which date from the 5th dynasty, have compartments for yellow, red, blue, brown, white, black, and green, making in all some 14 or 16 different tints. Black was obtained by calcining the bones of animals. The other substances employed in painting were indigenous to the country. The white is made of gypsum mixed with albumen or honey. The yellows are ochre or sulphuret of arsenic, the orpiment of our modern artists. The reds are ochre, cinnabar, or vermilion. The blues are pulverized lapis lazuli or silicate of copper. If the substance was rare or costly, a substitute drawn from the products of native industry was found. Lapis lazuli, for instance, was replaced by blue frit, made with an admixture of silicate of copper, and this was reduced to an impalpable powder. The painters kept their colours in tiny bags, and, as required, mixed them with water containing a little gum tragacanth. They laid them on by means of a reed, or a more or less fine hair brush. When well prepared, these pigments are remarkably solid, and have changed but little during the lapse of ages. The reds have darkened, the greens have faded, the blues have turned somewhat green or grey, but this is only on the surface. If that surface is scraped off, the colour underneath is brilliant and unchanged. Before the Theban period, no precautions were taken to protect the painter's work from the action of air and light. About the time of the 20th dynasty, however, it became customary to coat painted surfaces with a transparent varnish, which was soluble in water, and which was probably made from the gum of some kind of acacia. It was not always used in the same manner. Some painters varnished the whole surface, while others merely glazed the ornaments and accessories, without touching the flesh tints or the clothing. This varnish has cracked from the effects of age, or has become so dark as to spoil the work it was intended to preserve. Doubtless the Egyptians discovered the bad effects produced by it, as we no longer meet with it after the close of the 20th dynasty. Egyptian painters laid on broad, flat, uniform washes of colour. They did not paint in our sense of the term. They illuminated. Just as in drawing they reduced everything to lines, and almost wholly suppressed the internal modelling, so in adding colour they still further simplified their subject by merging all varieties of tone and all play of light and shadow in one uniform tint. Egyptian painting is never quite true and never quite false. Without pretending to be the faithful imitation of nature, it approaches nature as nearly as it may, sometimes understating, sometimes exaggerating, sometimes substituting ideal or conventional renderings for strict realities. Water, for instance, is always represented by a flat tint of blue, or by blue covered with zigzag lines in black. The buff and bluish tones of the vulture are translated into bright red and vivid blue. The flesh tints of men are of a dark reddish brown, and the flesh tints of women are pale yellow. The colours conventionally assigned to each animate and inanimate object were taught in the schools, and their use handed on unchanged from generation to generation. Now and then it happened that a painter more daring than his contemporaries ventured to break with tradition. In the 6th dynasty tombs at Deir el Gabrawi, there are instances where the flesh tint of the women is that conventionally devoted to the depiction of men. At Saqqara under the 5th dynasty, and at Abu Simbel under the 19th dynasty, we find men with skins as yellow as those of the women, while in the tombs of Thebes and Abydos, about the time of Thothmes IV and Horemheb, there occur figures with flesh tints of rose colour. It must not, however, be supposed that the effect produced by this artificial system was grating or discordant. Even in the works of small size, such as the illuminated manuscript of the Book of the Dead, or the decoration of mummy cases and funerary coffers, there is both sweetness and harmony of colour. The most brilliant hues are boldly placed side by side, yet with full knowledge of the relations subsisting between those hues, and of the phenomena which must necessarily result from such relations. They neither jar together, nor war with each other, nor extinguish each other. On the contrary, each maintains its own value, and all, by mere juxtaposition, give rise to the half tones which harmonise them. Turning from small things to large ones, from the page of the papyrus or the panel of sycamore wood to the walls of tombs and temples, we find skilful employment of flat tints equally soothing and agreeable to the eye. Each wall is treated as a whole, the harmony of colour being carried out from bottom to top throughout the various superimposed stages into which the surface was divided. Sometimes the colours are distributed according to a scale of rhythm or symmetry, balancing and counterbalancing each other. Sometimes one special tint predominates, thus determining the general tone and subordinating every other hue. The vividness of the final effect is always calculated according to the quality and quantity of light by which the picture is destined to be seen. In very dark halls, the force of colour is carried as far as it will go, because it would not otherwise have been visible by the flickering light of lamps and torches. On outer wall surfaces and on pylon fronts, it was as vivid as in the darkest depths of excavated catacombs, and this because, no matter how extreme it might be, the sun would subdue its splendour. But in half-lighted places, such as the porticos of temples and the antechambers of tombs, colour is so dealt with as to be soft and discreet. In a word, painting was in Egypt the mere humble servant of architecture and sculpture. We must not dream of comparing it with our own, or even with that of the Greeks. But if we take it simply for what it is, accepting it in the secondary place assigned to it, we cannot fail to recognise its unusual merits. Egyptian painting excelled in the sense of monumental decoration, and if we ever revert to the fashion of colouring the facades of our houses and our public edifices, we shall lose nothing by studying Egyptian methods or reproducing Egyptian processes. End of Chapter 4, Section 2. Recording by Timothy Ferguson, Gold Coast, Australia. Chapter 4, Section 3 of Manual of Egyptian Archaeology and Guide to the Study of Antiquities in Egypt by Gaston Maspero. Translated by Amelia B. Edwards. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Timothy Ferguson. Chapter 4, Painting and Sculpture. Section 3, Works of Sculpture. To this day, the most ancient statue known is a colossus, namely the Great Sphinx of Giza. It was already in existence at the time of Khufu, Cheops, and perhaps we should not be far wrong if we ventured to ascribe it to the generations before Menna, called in the priestly chronicles the servants of Horus. Hewn in the living rock at the extreme verge of the Libyan plateau, it seems, as the representative of Horus, to uprear its head in order to be the first to catch sight of his father, Ra, the rising sun, across the valley. For centuries the sands have buried it to the chin, yet without protecting it from ruin. Its battered body preserves but the general form of a lion's body. The paws and breast, restored by the Ptolemies and the Caesars, retain but a part of the stone facing, with which they were then closed in order to mask the ravages of time. The lower part of the headdress has fallen, and the diminished neck looks too slender to sustain the enormous weight of the head. The nose and beard have been broken off by fanatics, and the red hue which formerly enlivened the features is almost wholly effaced, and yet, notwithstanding its fallen fortunes, the monster preserves an expression of sovereign strength and greatness. The eyes gaze out afar with a look of intense and profound thoughtfulness. The mouth still wears a smile. The whole countenance is informed with power and repose. The art which conceived and carved this prodigious statue was a finished art, an art which had attained self-mastery, and which was sure of its effects. How many centuries had it taken to arrive at this degree of maturity and perfection? In certain pieces belonging to various museums, such as the statues of Sipa and his wife at the Louvre, and the bas-reliefs of the tomb of Kabiusukari at Gizeh, critics have mistakenly recognised the faltering first efforts of an unskilled people. The stiffness of attitude and gesture, the exaggerated squareness of the shoulders, the line of green paint under the eyes, in a word, all those characteristics which are quoted as signs of extreme antiquity, are found in certain monuments of the 5th and 6th dynasties, The contemporary sculptors of any given period were not all equally skilful. If some were capable of doing good work, the greater number were mere craftsmen; and we must be careful not to ascribe awkward manipulation or lack of teaching to the timidity of archaism. The works of the primitive dynasties yet sleep undiscovered beneath 70 feet of sand at the foot of the Sphinx. Those of the historic dynasties are daily exhumed from the depths of the neighbouring tombs. These have not yielded Egyptian art as a whole, but they have familiarized us with one of its schools, the school of Memphis. The Delta, Hermopolis, Abydos, the environs of Thebes and Aswan, do not appear upon the stage earlier than towards the Sixth Dynasty, and even so, we know them through but a small number of sepulchres long since violated and despoiled. The loss is probably not very great. Memphis was the capital, and thither the presence of the Pharaohs must have attracted all the talent of the vassal principalities. Judging from the results of our excavations in the Memphite necropolis alone, it is possible to determine the characteristics of both sculpture and painting in the time of Seneferu and his successors with as much exactness as if we were already in possession of all the monuments which the valley of the Nile yet holds in reserve for future explorers. The lesser folk of the art world excelled in the manipulation of brush and chisel, and that their skill was of a high order is testified by the thousands of tableaux they have left behind them. The relief is low, the colour sober, the composition learned. Architecture, trees, vegetation, irregularities of ground are summarily indicated, and are introduced only when necessary to the due interpretation of the scene represented. Men and animals, on the other hand, are rendered with a wealth of detail, a truth of character, and sometimes a force of treatment to which the later schools of Egyptian art rarely attained. 6 wooden panels from the tomb of Hesi in the Gizeh Museum represent perhaps the finest known specimens of this branch of art. Mariette ascribed them to the Third Dynasty, and he may perhaps have been right, though for my own part I incline to date them from the Fifth Dynasty. In these panels there is nothing that can be called a subject. Hesi either sits or stands, and has 4 or 5 columns of hieroglyphs above his head; but the firmness of line, the subtlety of modelling, the ease of execution are unequalled. Never has wood been cut with a more delicate chisel or a firmer hand. The variety of attitude and gesture which we so much admire in the Egyptian bas relief is lacking to the statues. A mourner weeping, a woman bruising corn for bread, a baker rolling dough, are subjects as rare in the round as they are common in bas relief. In sculpture, the figure is generally represented either standing with the feet side by side and quite still, or with one leg advanced in the act of walking, or seated upon a chair or a cube, or kneeling, or still more frequently sitting on the ground cross-legged, as the fellahin are wont to sit to this day. This intentional monotony of style would be inexplicable if we were ignorant of the purpose for which the statues were intended. They represent the dead man for whom the tomb was made, his family, his servants, his slaves, and his kinfolk. The master is always shown sitting or standing, and he could not consistently be seen in any other attitude. The tomb is, in fact, the house in which he rests after the labours of life, as once he used to rest in his earthly home, and the scenes depicted upon the walls represent the work which he was officially credited with performing. Here he superintends the preliminary operations necessary to raise the food by which he is to be nourished in the form of funerary offerings, namely seed sowing, harvesting, stock breeding, fishing, hunting, and the like. In short, he superintends all the labour which is done for the eternal dwelling. When thus engaged, he is always standing upright, his head uplifted, his hands pendant, or holding the staff and baton of command. Elsewhere, the diverse offerings are brought to him one by one, and then he sits in a chair of state. These are his 2 attitudes, whether as a bas-relief subject or a statue. Standing, he receives the homage of his vassals; sitting, he partakes of the family repast. The people of his household comport themselves before him as becomes their business and station. His wife either stands beside him, sits on the same chair, or on a second chair by his side, or squats beside his feet, as during his lifetime. His son, if a child at the time when the statue was ordered, is represented in the garb of infancy, or with the bearing and equipment proper to his position if a man. The slaves bruise the corn, the cellars tar the wine jars, the hired mourners weep and tear their hair. His little social world followed the Egyptian to his tomb, the duties of his attendants being prescribed for them after death, just as they had been prescribed for them during life; and the kind of influence which the religious conception of the soul exercised over the art of the sculptor did not end there. From the moment that the statue is regarded as the support of the double, it becomes a condition of primary importance that the statue shall reproduce, at least in the abstract, the proportions and distinctive peculiarities of the corporeal body; and this in order that the double shall more easily adapt himself to his new body of stone or wood. The head is therefore always a faithful portrait, but the body, on the contrary, is, as it were, a medium kind of body, representing the original at his highest development, and consequently able to exert the fulness of his physical powers when admitted to the society of the gods. Hence men are always sculptured in the prime of life, and women with the delicate proportions of early womanhood. This conventional idea was never departed from, unless in cases of very marked deformity. The statue of a dwarf reproduced all the ugly peculiarities of the dwarf's own body, and it was important that it should so reproduce them. If a statue of the ordinary type had been placed in the tomb of the dead man, his ka, accustomed during life to the deformity of his limbs, would not be able to adapt itself to an upright and shapely figure, and would therefore be deprived of the conditions necessary to his future well-being. The artist was free to vary the details and arrange the accessories according to his fancy, but without missing the point of his work, he could not change the attitude or depart from the general style of the conventional portrait statue. This persistent monotony of poise and subject produces a depressing effect upon the spectator, an effect which is augmented by the obtrusive character given to the supports. These statues are mostly backed by a kind of rectangular pediment, which is either squared off just at the base of the skull, or carried up in a point and lost in the headdress, or rounded at the top and shown above the head of the figure. The arms are seldom separated from the body, but are generally in one piece with the sides and hips. The whole length of the leg, which is placed in advance of the other, is very often connected with the pediment by a band of stone. It has been conjectured that this course was imposed upon the sculptor by reason of the imperfection of his tools, and the consequent danger of fracturing the statue when cutting away the superfluous material, an explanation which may be correct as regards the earliest schools, but which does not hold good for the time of the Fourth Dynasty. We could point out more than one piece of sculpture of that period, even in granite, in which all the limbs are free, having been cut away by means of either the chisel or the drill. If pediment supports were persisted in to the end, their use must have been due, not to helplessness, but to routine, or to an exaggerated respect for ancient method. Most museums are poor in statues of the Memphite school. France and Egypt possess, however, some 20 specimens, which suffice to ensure it an honourable place in the history of art. At the Louvre we have the cross-legged scribe, and the statues of Skemka and Pa-un-Nefer. At Gizeh there are the Sheikh el Beled and his wife Khafra, Ra-Nefer, the prince and general Ra-Hotep, and his wife Nefert, a kneeling scribe and a cross-legged scribe. The original of the cross-legged scribe of the Louvre was not a handsome man, but the vigour and fidelity of his portrait amply compensate for the absence of ideal beauty. His legs are crossed and laid flat to the ground in one of those attitudes common among Orientals, yet all but impossible to Europeans. The bust is upright and well balanced upon the hips. The head is uplifted. The right hand holds the reed pen, which pauses in its place on the open papyrus scroll. Thus, for 6,000 years, he has waited for his master to go on with the long interrupted dictation. The face is square cut, and the strongly marked features indicate a man in the prime of life. The mouth, wide and thin-lipped, rises slightly towards the corners, which are lost in the projecting muscles by which it is framed in. The cheeks are bony and lank, the ears are thick and heavy, and stand out well from the head. The thick coarse hair is cut close above the brow. The eyes, which are large and well open, owe their lifelike vivacity to an ingenious contrivance of the ancient artist. The orbit has been cut out from the stone, the hollow being filled with an eye composed of enamel, white and black. The edges of the eyelids are of bronze, and a small silver nail inserted behind the iris receives and reflects the light in such wise as to imitate the light of life. The contours of the flesh are somewhat full and wanting in firmness, as would be the case in middle life, if the man's occupation debarred him from active exercise. The forms of the arm and back are in good relief. The hands are hard and bony, with fingers of somewhat unusual length, and the knees are sculptured with a minute attention to anatomical details. The whole body is, as it were, informed by the expression of the face, and is dominated by the attentive suspense which breathes in every feature. The muscles of the arm, of the bust, and of the shoulder are caught in half repose, and are ready to return at once to work. This careful observance of the professional attitude, or the characteristic gesture, is equally marked in the Gizeh cross-legged scribe and in all the ancient empire statues which I have had the opportunity of studying. The cross-legged scribe of Gizeh was discovered by M. de Morgan at Saqqara in the beginning of 1893. This statue exhibits a no less surprising vigour and certainty of intention and execution on the part of the sculptor than does its fellow of the Louvre, while representing a younger man of full, firm, and supple figure. Khafra is a king. He sits squarely upon his chair of state, his hands upon his knees, his chest thrown forward, his head erect, his gaze confident. Had the emblems of his rank been destroyed and the inscription effaced which tells his name, his bearing alone would have revealed the Pharaoh. Every trait is characteristic of the man who, from childhood upwards, has known himself to be invested with sovereign authority. Ra-Nefer belonged to one of the great feudal families of his time. He stands upright, his arms down, his left leg forward, in the attitude of a prince inspecting a march-past of his vassals. The countenance is haughty, the attitude bold, but Ra-Nefer does not impress us with the almost superhuman calm and decision of Khafra. General Ra-Hotep, despite his title and his high military rank, looks as if he were of inferior birth. Stalwart and square-cut, he has somewhat of the rustic in his physiognomy. Nefert, on the contrary, was a princess of the blood royal, and her whole person is, as it were, informed with a certain air of resolution and command, which the sculptor has expressed very happily. She wears a close-fitting garment, opening to a point in front. The shoulders, bosom, and bodily contours are modelled under the drapery with a grace and reserve which it is impossible to praise too highly. Her face, round and plump, is framed in masses of fine black hair, confined by a richly ornamented bandeau. This wedded pair are in limestone, painted, the husband being coloured of a reddish-brown hue, and the wife of a tawny buff. Turning to the Sheikh el Beled, we descend several degrees in the social scale. Ra-Em-Ka was a superintendent of works, which probably means that he was an overseer of corvée labour at the time of the building of the Great Pyramids. He belonged to the middle class, and his whole person expresses vulgar contentment and self-satisfaction. We seem to see him in the act of watching his workmen, his staff of acacia wood in his hand. The feet of the statue had perished, but have been restored. The body is stout and heavy, and the neck thick. The head, despite its vulgarity, does not lack energy. The eyes are inserted like those of the cross-legged scribe. By a curious coincidence, the statue, which was found at Saqqara, happened to be strikingly like the local Sheikh el Beled, or headman of the village. Always quick to seize upon the amusing side of an incident, the Arab diggers at once called it the Sheikh el Beled, and it has retained the name ever since. The statue of his wife, interred beside his own, is unfortunately mutilated. It is a mere trunk without legs or arms, yet enough remains to show that the figure represented a good type of Egyptian middle-class matron, commonplace in appearance and somewhat acid of temper. The kneeling scribe of the Gizeh collection belongs to the lowest middle-class rank, such as it is at the present day. Had he not been dead more than 6,000 years, I could protest that I had not long ago met him face to face in one of the little towns of Upper Egypt. He had just bought a roll of papyrus, or a tablet covered with writing, for his master's approval. Kneeling in the prescribed attitude of an inferior, his hands crossed, his shoulders rounded, his head slightly bent forward, he waits till the great man shall have read it through. Of what is he thinking? A scribe might feel some not unreasonable apprehensions when summoned thus into the presence of his superior. The stick played a prominent part in official life, and an error of addition, a fault in orthography, or an order misunderstood would be enough to bring down a shower of blows. The sculptor has, with inimitable skill, seized the expression of resigned uncertainty and passive gentleness which is the result of a whole life of servitude. There is a smile upon his lips, but it is the smile of etiquette, in which there is no gladness. The nose and cheeks are puckered up, in harmony with the forced grimace upon the mouth. His large eyes, again in enamel, have the fixed look of one who waits vacantly without making any effort to concentrate his sight or his thoughts upon a definite object. His face lacks both intelligence and vivacity, but his work, after all, called for no special nimbleness of wit. Khafra is in diorite. Ra-Em-Ka and his wife are carved in wood. The other statues named are of limestone, yet, whatever the material employed, the play of chisel is alike free, subtle, and delicate. The head of the scribe and the bas-relief portrait of Pharaoh Menkaure in the Louvre, the dwarf Nemhotep, and the slaves who prepare food offerings at Gizeh are in no wise inferior to the cross-legged scribe or the Sheikh el Beled. The baker kneading his dough is thoroughly in his work. his half-stooping attitude, and the way in which he leans upon the kneading trough, are admirably natural. The dwarf has a big elongated head, balanced by two enormous ears. He has a foolish face, an ill-shapen mouth, and narrow slits of eyes inclining upwards to the temples. The bust is well developed, but the trunk is out of proportion with the rest of his person. The artist has done his best to disguise the lower limbs under a fine white tunic, but one feels that it is too long for the little man's arms and legs. The thighs could have existed only in a rudimentary form, and Nemhotep, standing as best he can upon his misshapen feet, seems to be off his balance, and ready to fall forward upon his face. It would be difficult to find another work of art in which the characteristics of dwarfdom are more cleverly reproduced. The sculpture of the First Theban Empire is in close connection with that of Memphis. Methods, materials, design, composition, all are borrowed from the elder school, the only new departure being in proportions assigned to the human figure. From the time of the 11th dynasty, the legs become longer and slighter, the hips smaller, the body and neck more slender. Works of this period are not to be compared with the best productions of the earlier centuries. The wall paintings of Siut, of Bersheh, of Beni Hassan, and of Aswan are not equal to those in the mastabas of Saqqara and Gizeh, nor are the most carefully executed contemporary statues worthy to take a place beside the Sheikh el Beled or the cross-legged scribe. Portrait statues of private persons, especially those found at Thebes, are, so far as I have seen, decidedly bad, the execution being rude and the expression vulgar. The royal statues of this period, which are nearly all in black or grey granite, have been for the most part usurped by kings of later date. Usertesen III, whose head and feet are in the Louvre, was appropriated by Amenhotep III, as the Sphinx of the Louvre and the Colossi of Gizeh were appropriated by Rameses II. Many museums possess specimens of supposed Ramesside pharaohs, which, upon more careful inspection, we are compelled to ascribe to the 13th or 14th dynasty. Those of undisputed identity, such as Sebek-hotep III of the Louvre, the Murmashiu of Tanis, the Sebekemsaf of Gizeh, and the Colossi of the Isle of Argo, though very skilfully executed, are wanting in originality and vigour. One would say, indeed, that the sculptors had purposely endeavoured to turn them all out after the one smiling and commonplace pattern. Great is the contrast when we turn from these giant dolls to the black granite sphinxes discovered by Mariette at Tanis in 1861, and by him ascribed to the Hyksos period. Here energy, at all events, is not lacking. Wiry and compact, the lion's body is shorter than in sphinxes of the usual type. The head, instead of wearing the customary klaft or headgear of folded linen, is clothed with an ample mane, which surrounds the face. The eyes are small, the nose is aquiline and depressed at the tip, the cheekbones are prominent, the lower lip slightly protrudes. The general effect of the face is, in short, so unlike the types we are accustomed to find in Egypt, that it has been accepted in proof of an Asiatic origin. These sphinxes are unquestionably anterior to the 18th dynasty, because one of the kings of Avaris, named Apepi, has cut his name upon the shoulder of each. Arguing from this fact, it was, however, too hastily concluded that they are works of the time of that prince. On a closer examination, we see that they had already been dedicated to some pharaoh of a yet earlier period, and that Apepi had merely usurped them; and M. Golenischeff has shown that they were made for Amenemhat III of the 12th dynasty with his features. Those so-called Hyksos monuments may be the product of a local school, the origin of which may have been independent, and its traditions quite different from the traditions of the Memphite workshops. But except at Abydos, El Kab, Aswan, and some 2 or 3 other places, the provincial art of Egypt is so little known to us that I dare not lay too much stress upon this hypothesis. Whatever the origin of the Tanite school, it continued to exist long after the expulsion of the Hyksos invaders, since one of its best examples, a group representing the Nile of the North and the Nile of the South, bearing trays laden with flowers and fish, was consecrated by Piseb Kanu of the 21st dynasty. The first 3 dynasties of the new empire have bequeathed us more monuments than all the others put together. Painted bas-reliefs, statues of kings and private persons, colossi, sphinxes, may be counted by hundreds between the mouths of the Nile and the Fourth Cataract. The old sacerdotal cities, Memphis, Thebes, Abydos, are naturally the richest, but so great was the impetus given to art that even remote provincial towns, such as Abu Simbel, Rhodesia, and Mesheikh, have their chefs d'oeuvre, like the great cities. The official portraits of Amenhotep I at Turin, of Thothmes and Thothmes III at the British Museum, at Karnak, at Turin, and at Gizeh, are conceived in the style of the 12th and 13th dynasties, and are deficient in originality; but the bas reliefs in temples and tombs show a marked advance upon those of the earlier ages. The modelling is finer, the figures are more numerous and better grouped, the relief is higher, the effects of perspective are more carefully worked out. The wall subjects of Deir el Bahari, the tableau in the tombs of Hui, of Re Khmara, of Anna, of Kamha, and of 20 more at Thebes, are surprisingly rich, brilliant, and varied. Awakening to a sense of the picturesque, art has introduced into their compositions all those details of architecture, of uneven ground, of foreign plants, and the like, which formerly they neglected or barely indicated. The taste for the colossal, which had fallen somewhat into abeyance since the time of the Great Sphinx, came once again to the surface, and was developed anew. Amenhotep III was not content with statues of 25 or 30 feet in height, such as were in favour among his ancestors. Those which he erected in advance of his memorial chapel on the left bank of the Nile in western Thebes, one of which is the vocal Memnon of the classic writers, sit 50 feet high. Each was carved from a single block of sandstone, and they are as elaborately finished as though they were of ordinary size. The avenues of sphinxes which this Pharaoh marshalled before the temples of Luxor and Karnak do not come to an end at 50 or 100 yards from the gateway, but are prolonged for great distances. In one avenue they have the human head upon the lion's body; in another they are fashioned in the semblance of kneeling rams. Khûenaten, the revolutionary successor of Amenhotep III, far from discouraging this movement, did what he could to promote it. Never, perhaps, were Egyptian sculptors more unrestricted than by him at Tel el Amarna. Military reviews, chariot driving, popular festivals, state receptions, the distribution of honours and rewards by the king in person, representations of palaces, villas, and gardens, were among the subjects which they were permitted to treat; and these subjects differed in so many respects from traditional routine, that they could give free play to their fancy and to their natural genius. The spirit and gusto with which they took advantage of their opportunities would scarcely be believed by one who had not seen their works at Tel el Amarna. Some of their bas reliefs are designed in almost correct perspective, and in all the life and stir of large crowds are rendered with irreproachable truth. The political and religious reaction which followed this reign arrested the evolution of art, and condemned sculptors and painters to return to the observance of traditional rules. Their personal influence and their teaching continued, however, to make themselves felt under Horemheb, under Seti I., and even under Rameses II. If, during more than a century, Egyptian art remained free, graceful, and refined, that improvement was due to the school of Tel el Amarna. In no instance, perhaps, did it produce work more perfect than the bas reliefs of the Temple of Abydos, or those of the tomb of Seti I. The head of the conqueror, always studied con amore, is a marvel of reserved and sensitive grace. Rameses II. charging the enemy at Abu Simbel is as fine as the portraits of Seti I., though in another style. The action of the arm which brandishes the lance is somewhat angular; but the expression of strength and triumph which animates the whole person of the warrior king, and the despairing resignation of the vanquished, compensate for this one defect. The group of Horemheb and the god Amen in the museum of Turin is a little dry in treatment. The faces of both god and king lack expression, and their bodies are heavy and ill balanced. The fine colossi in red granite which Horemheb placed against the uprights of the inner door of his first pylon at Karnak, the bas reliefs on the wall of his speos at Silsilis, his own portrait, and that of one of the ladies of his family, now in the museum of Gizeh, are, so to say, spotless and faultless. The queen's face is animated and intelligent. The eyes are large and prominent; the mouth is wide but well shaped. The head is carved in hard limestone of a creamy tint, which seems to soften the somewhat satirical expression of her eyes and smile. The king is in black granite, and the sombre hue of the stone at once produces a mournful impression upon the spectator. His youthful face is pervaded by an air of melancholy, such as we rarely see depicted in portraits of pharaohs of the great period. The nose is straight and delicate; the eyes are long; the lips are large, full, somewhat contracted at the corners, and strongly defined at the edges. The chin is overweighted by the traditional false beard. Every detail is treated with as much skill as if the sculptor were dealing with a soft stone, instead of with a material which resisted the chisel. Such indeed is the mastery of the execution, that one forgets the difficulties of the task in the excellence of the results. It is unfortunate that Egyptian artists never signed their works, for the sculptor of this portrait of Horemheb deserves to be remembered. Like the 18th dynasty, the 19th dynasty delighted in colossi. Those of Ramesses II at Luxor measured from 18 to 20 feet in height. The colossal Ramesses of the Ramesseum sat 60 feet in height, and that of Tanis about 70. The colossi of Abu Simbel, without being of quite such formidable proportions, faced the river in imposing array. To say that the decline of Egyptian art began with Ramesses II is a commonplace of contemporary criticism, yet nothing is less true than an axiom of this kind. Many statues and bas-reliefs executed during his reign are no doubt inconceivably rude and ugly, but these are chiefly found in provincial towns where the schools were indifferent, and where the artists had no fine examples before them. At Thebes, at Memphis, at Abydos, at Tanis, in those towns of the Delta where the court habitually resided, and even at Abu Simbel and Beit el-Wali, the sculptures of Ramesses II yield nothing in point of excellence to those of Seti I and Horemheb. The decadence did not begin till after the reign of Merenptah, when civil war and foreign invasion brought Egypt to the brink of destruction. The arts, like all else, suffered and rapidly declined. It is sad to follow their downward progress under the later Ramessides, whether in the wall subjects of the royal tombs, or the bas-reliefs of the temple of Khonsû, or on the columns of the hypostyle hall at Karnak. Wood carving maintained its level during a somewhat longer period. The admirable statues of priests and children at Turin date from the 20th dynasty. The advent of Sheshonq and the intestine strife of the provinces at length completed the ruin of Thebes, and the school which had produced so many masterpieces perished miserably. The Renaissance did not dawn till near the end of the Ethiopian dynasty, some 300 years later. The overpraised statue of Queen Amenritis already manifests some noteworthy qualities. The limbs, somewhat long and fragile, are delicately treated, but the head is heavy, being overweighted by the wig peculiar to goddesses. Psammetichus I, when his victories had established him upon the throne, busied himself in the restoration of the temples. Under his auspices, the valley of the Nile became one vast studio of painting and sculpture. The art of engraving hieroglyphs attained a high degree of excellence. Fine statues and bas-reliefs were everywhere multiplied, and a new school arose. A marvellous command of material, a profound knowledge of detail, and a certain elegance tempered by severity are the leading characteristics of this new school. The Memphites preferred limestone, the Thebans selected red or grey granite, but the Satis especially attacked basalt, breccia, and serpentine, and with these fine-grained and almost homogeneous substances they achieved extraordinary results. They seem to have sought difficulties for the mere pleasure of triumphing over them, and we have proof of the way in which artists of real merit bestowed years and years on the chasing of sarcophagus lids, and the carving of statues in blocks of the hardest material. The Thuwurus and the 4 monuments from the tomb of Psammetichus in the Gizeh Museum are the most remarkable objects hitherto discovered in this class of work. The Thuwurus was the especial protectress of maternity, and presided over childbirth. Her portrait was discovered by some native sebak diggers in the midst of the mounds of the ancient city of Thebes. She was found standing upright in a little chapel of white limestone, which had been dedicated to her by one Pibessa, a priest, in the name of Queen Nitocris, daughter of Psammetichus I. This charming hippopotamus, whose figure is perhaps more plump than graceful, is a fine example of the difficulties overcome, but I do not know that she has any other merit. The group belonging to Psammetichus has, at all events, some artistic value. It consists of 4 pieces of green basalt, namely a table of offerings, a statue of Osiris, a statue of Nephthys, and a Hathor cow supporting a statuette of the deceased. All 4 are somewhat flaccid, somewhat artificial, but the faces of the divinities and the deceased are not wanting in sweetness. The action of the cow is good, and the little figure under her protection falls naturally into its place. Certain other pieces, less known than these, are however far superior. The side style is easy of recognition. It lacks the breadth and learning of the first Memphis school. It also lacks the grand and sometimes rude manner of the great Theban school. The proportions of the human body are reduced and elongated, and the limbs lose in vigour what they gain in elegance. A noteworthy change in the choice of attitudes will also be remarked. Orientals find repose in postures which would be inexpressibly fatiguing to ourselves. For hours together they will kneel or sit tailor-wise, with the legs crossed and laid down flat to the ground, or squat, sitting upon their heels, with no other support than is afforded by that part of the sole of the foot which rests upon the ground; or they will sit upon the floor with their legs close together and their arms crossed upon their knees. These 4 attitudes were customary among the people from the time of the ancient empire. This we know from bas-reliefs, but the Memphite sculptors, deeming the two last ungraceful, excluded them from the domain of art, and rarely, if ever, reproduced them. The cross-legged scribe of the Louvre and the kneeling scribe of Gizeh show with what success they could employ the two first. The third was neglected, doubtless for the same reason, by the Theban sculptors. The fourth began to be currently adopted about the time of the 18th dynasty. It may be that this position was not in fashion among the moneyed classes, which alone could afford to order statues; or it may be that the artists themselves objected to an attitude which caused their sitters to look like square parcels with a human head on the top. The sculptors of the Sate period did not inherit that repugnance. They have, at all events, combined the action of the limbs in such a wise as may least offend the eye, and the position almost ceases to be ungraceful. The heads also are modelled to such perfection that they make up for many shortcomings. That of Pedishashi has an expression of youth and intelligent gentleness, such as we seldom meet with from an Egyptian hand. Other heads, on the contrary, are remarkable for their almost brutal frankness of treatment. In the small head of a scribe lately purchased for the Louvre, and in another belonging to Prince Ibrahim at Cairo, the wrinkled brow, the crow's feet at the corners of the eyes, the hard lines about the mouth, and the knobs upon the skull are brought out with scrupulous fidelity. The Saïd school was in fact divided into two parties. One sought inspiration in the past, and, by a return to the methods of the old Memphite school, endeavoured to put fresh life into the effeminate style of the day. This it accomplished, and so successfully that its works are sometimes mistaken for the best productions of the 4th and 5th dynasties. The other, without too openly departing from established tradition, preferred to study from the life, and thus drew nearer to nature than any previous age. This school would perhaps have prevailed had Egyptian art not been directed into a new channel by the Macedonian conquest, and by centuries of intercourse with the Greeks. The new departure was a slow development. Sculptors began by clothing the successors of Alexander in Egyptian garb, and transforming them into pharaohs, just as they had in olden time transformed the Hyksos and the Persians. Works dating from the reigns of the first Ptolemies scarcely differ from those of the best Saïd period, and it is only here and there that we detect traces of Greek influence. Thus the Colossus of Alexander II at Gizeh wears a flowing headdress, from beneath which his crisp curls have found their way. Soon, however, the sight of Greek masterpieces led the Egyptians of Alexandria, of Memphis, and of the cities of the Delta to modify their artistic methods. Then arose a mixed school which combined certain elements of the national art with certain other elements borrowed from Hellenic art. The Alexandrian Isis of the Gizeh Museum is clad as the Isis of pharaonic times, but she has lost the old slender shape and straightened bearing. A mutilated effigy of a prince of Siut, also at Gizeh, would almost pass for an indifferent Greek statue. The most forcible work of this hybrid class which has come down to us is the portrait statue of one Hor, discovered at the foot of Kom ed Damas, the site of the tomb of Alexander. The head is good, though in a somewhat dry style. The long pinch nose, the close-set eyes, the small mouth with drawn-in corners, the square chin, every feature, in short, contributes to give a hard and obstinate character to the face. The hair is closely cropped, yet not so closely as to prevent it from dividing naturally into thick short curls. The body, clothed in the chlamys, is awkwardly shapen, and too narrow for the head. One arm hangs pendant, the other is brought round to the front, the feet are lost. All these monuments are the result of few excavations, and I do not doubt that the soil of Alexandria would yield many such if it could be methodically explored. The school which produced them continued to draw nearer and nearer to the schools of Greece, and the stiff manner, which is never wholly lost, was scarcely regarded as a defect at an epoch when certain sculptors in the service of Rome especially affected the archaic style. I should not be surprised if those statues of priests and priestesses wearing divine insignia, with which Hadrian adorned the Egyptian rooms of his villa at Tibur, might not be attributed to the artists of this hybrid school. In those parts which were remote from the Delta, native art, being left to its own resources, languished and slowly perished. Nor was this because Greek models or even Greek artists were lacking. In the Thebaid, in the Fayum at Cyrene, I have both discovered and purchased statuettes and statues of Hellenic style and of correct and careful execution. One of these, from Coptos, is apparently a miniature replica of a Venus, analogous to the Venus of Milo. But the principal sculptors were too dull or too ignorant to take such advantage of these models as was taken by their Alexandrian brethren. When they sought to render the Greek suppleness of figure and fullness of limb they only succeeded in missing the rigid but learned precision of their former masters. In place of the fine, delicate, low relief of the old school, they adopted a relief which, though very prominent, was soft, round, and feebly modelled. The eyes of their personages have a foolish leer, the nostrils slant upwards, the corners of the mouth, the chin, and indeed all the features are drawn up as if converging towards a central point, which is stationed in the middle of the ear. Two schools, each independent of the other, have bequeathed their works to us. The least known flourished in Ethiopia at the court of the half-civilized kings who resided at Meroe. A group bought from Naga in 1882, and now in the Giza collection, shows the work of this school during the first century of our era. A god and a queen, standing side by side, are roughly cut in a block of grey granite. The work is coarse and heavy, but not without energy. Isolated and lost in the midst of savage tribes, the school which produced it sank rapidly into barbarism, and expired towards the end of the age of the Antonines. The Egyptian school, sheltered by the power of Rome, survived a little longer. As sagacious as the Ptolemies, the Caesars knew that by flattering the religious prejudices of their Egyptian subjects, they consolidated their own rule in the valley of the Nile. At an enormous cost, they restored and rebuilt the temples of the national gods, working after the old plans and in the old spirit of pharaonic times. The great earthquake of B.C. 22 destroyed Thebes, which now became a mere place of pilgrimage, where the devotees repaired to listen to the voice of Memnon at the rising of Aurora. But at Dendera and Ombos, Tiberius and Claudius finished the decoration of the great temples. Caligula worked at Coptos, and the Antonines enriched Esna and Philae. The gangs of workmen employed in their names were still competent to cut thousands of bas-reliefs according to the rules of the olden time. Their work was feeble, ungraceful, absurd, inspired solely by routine, yet it was founded on antique tradition enfeebled and degenerate, but still alive. The troubles which convulsed the 3rd century of our era, the incursions of barbarians, the progress and triumph of Christianity, caused the suspension of the latest works and the dispersion of the last craftsmen. With them died all that yet survived of the national art. End of chapter 4. Recording by Timothy Ferguson, Gold Coast, Australia. Chapter 5, Section 1 of Manual of Egyptian Archaeology and Guide to the Study of Antiquities in Egypt by Gaston Maspero. Translated by Amelia B. Edwards. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Timothy Ferguson. Chapter 5, The Industrial Arts. I have treated briefly of the noble arts. It remains to say something of the industrial arts. All classes of society in Egypt were, from an early period, imbued with the love of luxury, and with a taste for the beautiful. Living or dead, the Egyptian desired to have jewels and costly amulets upon his person, and to be surrounded by choice furniture and elegant utensils. The objects of his daily use must be distinguished, if not by richness of material, at least by grace of form, and, in order to satisfy his requirements, the clay, the stone, the metals, the woods, and other products of distant lands were laid under contribution. Section 1. Stone, clay, and glass. It is impossible to pass through a gallery of Egyptian antiquities without being surprised by the prodigious number of small objects in pietra dura which have survived till the present time. As yet we have found neither the diamond, the ruby, nor the sapphire, but, with these exceptions, the domain of the lapidary was almost as extensive as at the present day. That domain included the amethyst, the emerald, the garnet, the aquamarine, the chrysoprase, the innumerable varieties of agate and jasper, lapis lazuli, felspar, obsidian, also various rocks such as granite, serpentine, and porphyry, certain fossils as yellow amber, and some kinds of turquoise, organic remains as coral, mother of pearl, and pearls, metallic ores and carbonates such as hematite and malachite, and the calcite or oriental turquoise. These substances were for the most part cut in the shape of round, square, oval, spindle-shaped, pear-shaped, or lozenge-shaped beads. Strung and arranged row above row, these beads were made into necklaces, and are picked up by myriads in the sands of the great cemeteries of Memphis, Erment, Ekhmim, and Abydos. The perfection with which many are cut, the deftness with which they are pierced, and the beauty of the polish, do honour to the craftsmen who made them. But their skill did not end here. With the point, saw, drill, and grindstone, they finished these materials into an infinity of shapes: hearts, human fingers, serpents, animals, images of divinities. All these were amulets, and they were probably less valued for the charm of the workmanship than for the supernatural virtues which they were supposed to possess. The girdle buckle in carnelian symbolized the blood of Isis, and washed away the sins of the wearer. The frog was emblematic of renewed birth. The little lotus flower column in green felspar typified the divine gift of eternal youth. The uat, or sacred eye, tied to the wrist or arm by a slender string, protected against the evil eye, against words spoken in envy or anger, and against the bites of serpents. Commerce dispersed these objects throughout all parts of the ancient world, and many of them, especially those which represented the sacred beetle, were imitated abroad by the Phoenicians and Syrians, and by the craftsmen of Greece, Asia Minor, Etruria, and Sardinia. This insect was called kepha in Egyptian, and its name was supposed to be derived from the root kephra, to become. By an obvious play upon words, the beetle was made the emblem of terrestrial life, and of the successive becomings or developments of man in the life to come. The scarabaeus amulet is, therefore, a symbol of duration, present or future, and to wear one was to provide against annihilation. 1,000 mystic meanings were evolved from this first idea, each in some subtle sense connected with one or other of the daily acts or usages of life, so that scarabaei were multiplied ad infinitum. They are found in all materials and sizes, some having hawks' heads, some with rams' heads, some with heads of men or bulls. Some are wrought or inscribed on the underside, others are left flat and plain underneath, and others again but vaguely recall the form of the insect, and are called scaraboids. These amulets are pierced longwise, the whole being large enough to admit the passage of a fine wire of bronze or silver, or of a thread for suspension. The larger sort were regarded as images of the heart. These, having outspread wings attached, were fastened to the breast of the mummy, and are inscribed on the underside with a prayer adjuring the heart not to bear witness against the deceased at the day of judgment. In order to be still more efficacious, some scenes of adoration were occasionally added to the formula. For example, the disk of the moon adorned by 2 apes upon the shoulder, 2 squatting figures of Amen upon the wing sheaths; on the flat reverse a representation of the boat of the sun, and below the boat Osiris mummified, squatting between Isis and Nephthys, who overshadow him with their wings. The small scarabs, having begun as phylacteries, ended by becoming mere ornaments without any kind of religious meaning, just as crosses are now worn without thought of significance by the women of our own day. They were set as rings, as necklace pendants, as earrings, and as bracelets. The underside is often plain, but is more commonly ornamented with incised designs which involve no kind of modelling. Relief cutting, properly so called, as in cameo cutting, was unknown to Egyptian lapidaries before the Greek period. Scarabaei and subjects engraved on them have not as yet been fully classified and catalogued. The subjects consist of simple combinations, of lines, of scrolls, of interlacings without any precise signification, of symbols to which the owner attached a mysterious meaning unknown to everyone but himself, of names and titles of individuals, of royal ovals, which are historically interesting, of good wishes, of pious ejaculations, and of magic formulae. The earliest examples known date from the 4th dynasty, and are small and fine. Sometimes 6th dynasty scarabs are of obsidian and crystal, and early Middle Kingdom scarabs of amethyst, emerald, or even garnet. From the time of the 18th dynasty, scarabs may be counted by millions, and the execution is more or less fine according to the hardness of the stone. This holds good for amulets of all kinds. The hippopotamus heads, the hearts, the bar birds, which one picks up at Taud, to the south of Thebes, are barely roughed out, the amethyst and green felspar of which they are made having presented an almost unconquerable resistance to the point, saw, drill, and wheel. The belt buckles, angles, and headrests in red jasper, carnelian, and hematite are, on the contrary, finished to the minutest details, notwithstanding that carnelian and red jasper are even harder than green felspar. Lapis lazuli is insufficiently homogeneous, almost as hard as felspar, and seems as if it were incapable of being finely worked. Yet the Egyptians have used it for images of certain goddesses, Isis, Nephthys, Neith, Sekhet, which are marvels of delicate cutting. The modelling of the forms is carried out as boldly as if the material were more trustworthy, and the features lose none of their excellence if examined under a magnifying glass. For the most part, however, a different treatment was adopted. Instead of lavishing high finish upon the relief, it was obtained in a more summary way, the details of individual parts being sacrificed to the general effect. Those features of the face which project, and those which retire, are strongly accentuated. The thickness of the neck, the swell of the breast and shoulder, the slenderness of the waist, the fullness of the hips, are all exaggerated. The feet and hands are also slightly enlarged. The treatment is based upon a system, the results being boldly yet judiciously calculated. When the object has to be sculptured in miniature, a mathematical reduction of the model is not so happy in its effect as might be supposed. The head loses character, the neck looks too weak, the bust is reduced to a cylinder with a slightly uneven surface. The feet do not look strong enough to support the weight of the body. The principal lines are not sufficiently distinct from the secondary lines. By suppressing most of the accessory forms and developing those most essential to the expression, the Egyptians steered clear of the danger of producing insignificant statuettes. The eye instinctively tones down whatever is too forcible, and supplies what is lacking. Thanks to these subtle devices of the ancient craftsman, a tiny statuette of this or that divinity, measuring scarcely an inch and a quarter in height, has almost the breadth and dignity of a colossus. The earthly goods of the gods and the dead were mostly in solid stone. I have elsewhere described the little funerary obelisks, the altar bases, the statues, and the tables of offerings found in tombs of the ancient empire. These tables were made of alabaster and limestone during the Pyramid period, of granite or red sandstone under the Theban kings, and of basalt or serpentine from the time of the 26th dynasty. But the fashions were not canonical, all stones being found in all periods. Some offering tables are mere flat discs, or discs very slightly hollowed. Others are rectangular, and are sculptured in relief with a service of loaves, vases, fruits, and quarters of beef and gazelle. In one instance, the table offering of Situ, the libations, instead of running off, fell into a square basin which is marked off in divisions, showing the height of the Nile at different seasons of the year in the reservoirs of Memphis, namely 23 cubits in summer during the inundation, 23 in autumn and early winter, and 22 at the close of winter and in springtime. In these various patterns there was little beauty. Yet one offering table found at Saqqara is a real work of art. It is of alabaster. Two lions, standing side by side, support a sloping rectangular tablet, whence the libation ran off by a small channel into a vase placed between the tails of the lions. The alabaster geese found at Lisht are not without artistic merit. They are cut lengthwise down the middle and hollowed out in the fashion of a box. Those which I have seen elsewhere, and generally speaking, all simulacra of offerings, as loaves, cakes, heads of oxen or gazelles, bunches of black grapes, and the like, in carved and painted limestone, are of doubtful taste and clumsy execution. They are not very common, and I have met with them only in tombs of the 5th and 12th dynasties. "Canopic" vases, on the contrary, were always carefully wrought. They were generally made in two kinds of stone, limestone and alabaster, but the heads which surmounted them were often of painted wood. The canopic vases of Pepi I. are of alabaster, and those of a king buried in the southernmost pyramid of Lisht are also of alabaster, as are the human heads upon the lids. One, indeed, is of such fine execution that I can only compare it with that of the statue of Khafra. The most ancient funerary statuettes yet found, those namely of the 11th dynasty, are of alabaster like the canopic vases, but from the time of the 13th dynasty they were cut in compact limestone. The workmanship is very unequal in quality. Some are real chefs d'oeuvre, and reproduce the physiognomy of the deceased as faithfully as a portrait statue. Lastly, there are the perfume vases, which complete the list of objects found in temples and tombs. The names of these vases are far from being satisfactorily established, and most of the special designations furnished in the texts as yet remain without equivalents in our language. The greater number were of alabaster, turned and polished. Some are heavy and ugly, while others are distinguished by an elegance and diversity of form which do honour to the inventive talent of the craftsman. Many are spindle-shaped and pointed at the end, or round in the body, narrow in the neck, and flat at the bottom. They are unornamented, except perhaps by the two lotus bud handles, or two lions' heads, or perhaps a little female head just at the rise of the neck. The smallest of these vases were not intended for liquids, but for pomades, medicinal ointments, and salves made with honey. Some of the more important series comprise large-bodied flasks with an upright cylindrical neck and a flat cover. In these the Egyptians kept the antimony powder with which they darkened their eyes and eyebrows. The coal pot was a universal toilet requisite, perhaps the only one commonly used by all classes of society. When designing it, the craftsman gave free play to his fancy, borrowing forms of men, plants, and animals for its adornment. Now it appears in the guise of a full-blown lotus; now it is a hedgehog, a hawk, a monkey clasping a column to its breast, or climbing up the side of a jar, a grotesque figure of the god Bez, a kneeling woman whose scooped-out body contained the powder, a young girl carrying a wine jar. Once started upon this path, the imagination of the artists knew no limits. As for materials, everything was made to serve in turn: granite, diorite, breccia, red jade, alabaster, and soft limestone, which lent itself more readily to caprices of form. Finally, a still more plastic and facile substance, clay, painted and glazed. It was not for want of material that the art of modelling and baking clays failed to be as fully developed in Egypt as in Greece. The valley of the Nile is rich in a fine and ductile potter's clay, with which the happiest results might have been achieved had the native craftsmen taken the trouble to prepare it with due care. Metals and hard stone were, however, always preferred for objects of luxury. The potter was fain, therefore, to be content with supplying only the commonest needs of household and daily life. He was wont to take whatever clay happened to be nearest to the place where he was working, and this clay was habitually badly washed, badly kneaded, and fashioned with the finger upon a primitive wheel worked by the hand. The firing was equally careless. Some pieces were barely heated at all, and melted it they came into contact with water, while others were as hard as tiles. All tombs of the ancient empire contained vases of red or yellow ware, often mixed, like the clay of bricks, with finely chopped straw or weeds. These are mostly large solid jars with oval bodies, short necks, and wide mouths, but having neither foot nor handles. With them are also found pipkins and pots in which to store the dead man's provisions, bowls more or less shallow, and flat plates, such as are still used by the fellahin. The poorer folk sometimes buried miniature table and kitchen services with their dead, as being less costly than full-sized vessels. The surface is seldom glazed, seldom smooth and lustrous, but is ordinarily covered with a coat of whitish unbaked paint, which scales off at a touch. Upon this surface there is neither incised design nor ornament in relief, nor any kind of inscription, but merely some 4 or 5 parallel lines in red, black, or yellow round the neck. The pottery of the earliest Theban dynasties, which I have collected at El Khozam and Gebelin, is more carefully wrought than the pottery of the Memphite period. It may be classified under 2 heads. The first comprises plain, smooth-bodied vases, black below and dark red above. On examining this ware, where broken, we see that the colour was mixed with the clay during the kneading, and that the 2 zones were separately prepared, roughly joined, and then uniformly glazed. The second class comprises vases of various and sometimes eccentric forms, moulded of red or tawny clay. Some are large cylinders closed at one end, others are flat, others oblong and boat-shaped, others, like cruets, joined together 2 and 2, yet with no channel of communication. The ornamentation is carried over the whole surface, and generally consists of straight parallel lines, cross lines, zigzags, dotted lines, or small crosses and lines in geometrical combination; all these patterns being in white when the ground is red, or in reddish-brown when the ground is yellow or whitish. Now and then we find figures of men and animals interspersed among the geometrical combinations. The drawing is rude, almost childish, and it is difficult to tell whether the subjects represent herds of antelopes or scenes of gazelle hunting. The craftsmen who produced these rude attempts were nevertheless contemporary with the artists who decorated the rock-cut tombs at Beni Hasan. As regards the period of Egypt's greatest military conquests, the Theban tombs of that age have supplied objects enough to stock a museum of pottery, but unfortunately the types are very uninteresting. To begin with, we find handmade sepulchral statues modelled in summary fashion from an oblong lump of clay. A pinch of the craftsman's fingers brought out the nose. 2 tiny knobs and 2 little stumps, separately modelled and stuck on, represented the eyes and arms. The better sort of figures were pressed in moulds of baked clay, of which several specimens have been found. They were generally moulded in one piece, then lightly touched up, then baked, and lastly, on coming out of the oven, were painted red, yellow, or white, and inscribed with the pen. Some are of very good style, and almost equal those made in limestone. The Ushabtiu of the scribe Hori, and those of the priest Horuta Saiti, found at Hawara, show what the Egyptians could have achieved in this branch of the art if they had cared to cultivate it. Funerary cones were objects purely devotional, and the most consummate art could have done nothing to make them elegant. A funerary cone consists of a long conical mass of clay, stamped at the larger end with a few rows of hieroglyphs stating the name, parentage, and titles of the deceased, the whole surface being coated with a whitish wash. These are simulacra of votive cakes intended for the eternal nourishment of the double. Many of the vases buried in tombs of this period are painted to imitate alabaster, granite, basalt, bronze, or even gold, and were cheap substitutes for those vases made in precious materials which wealthy mourners were wont to lavish on their dead. Among those especially intended to contain water or flowers, some are covered with designs drawn in red and black, such as concentric lines and circles, meanders, religious emblems, cross lines resembling network, festoons of flowers and buds, and long leafy stems carried downward from the neck to the body of the vase, and upward from the body of the vase to the neck. Those in the tombs of Sen-Netmu were decorated on one side with a large necklace or collar, like the collars found upon mummies, painted in very bright colours to simulate natural flowers or enamels. Canopic vases in baked clay, though rarely met with under the 18th dynasty, became more and more common as the prosperity of Thebes declined. The heads upon the lids are for the most part prettily turned, especially the human heads, modelled with the hand, scooped out to diminish the weight, and then slowly baked. Each was finally painted with the colours especially pertaining to the genius whose head was represented. Towards the time of the 20th dynasty, it became customary to enclose the bodies of sacred animals in vases of this type. Those found near Ekhmim contain jackals and hawks. Those of Saqqara are devoted to serpents, eggs, and mummified rats. Those of Abydos held the sacred ibis. These last are by far the finest. On the body of the vase, the protecting goddess Kuit is depicted with outspread wings, while Horus and Thoth are seen presenting the bandage and unguent vase, the whole subject being painted in blue and red upon a white ground. From the time of the Greek domination, the national poverty being always on the increase, baked clay was much used for coffins as well as for canopic vases. In the Isthmus of Suez, at Anas el Meneneh, in the Fayum, at Assan, and in Nubia, we find whole cemeteries in which the sarcophagi are made of baked clay. Some are like oblong boxes, rounded at each end, with a saddle-back lid. Some are in human form, but barbarous in style, the heads being surmounted by a pudding-shaped imitation of the ancient Egyptian headdress, and the features indicated by 2 or 3 strokes of the modelling tool or the thumb. 2 little lumps of clay stuck awkwardly upon the breast indicate the coffin of a woman. Even in these last days of Egyptian civilization, it was only the coarsest objects which were left of the natural hue of the baked clay. As of old, the surfaces were, as a rule, overlaid with a coat of colour, or with a richly gilded glaze. Glass was known to the Egyptians from the remotest period, and glass blowing is represented in tombs which date from some thousands of years before our era. The craftsman seated before the furnace takes up a small quantity of the fused substance upon the end of his cane, and blows it circumspectly, taking care to keep in contact with the flame so that it may not harden during the operation. Chemical analysis shows the constituent parts of Egyptian glass to have been nearly identical with our own, but it contains, besides silex, lime, alumina, and soda, a relatively large proportion of extraneous substances, as copper, oxide of iron, and oxide of manganese, which they apparently knew not how to eliminate. Hence Egyptian glass is scarcely ever colourless, but inclines to an uncertain shade of yellow or green. Some ill-made pieces are so utterly decomposed that they flake away, or fall to iridescent dust at the lightest touch. Others have suffered little from time or damp, but are streaky and full of bubbles. A few are, however, perfectly homogeneous and limpid. Colourless glass was not esteemed by the Egyptians, as it is by ourselves. Whether opaque or transparent, they preferred it coloured. The dyes were obtained by mixing metallic oxides with the ordinary ingredients, that is to say, copper and cobalt for the blues, copperas for the greens, manganese for the violets and browns, iron for the yellows, and lead or tin for the whites. One variety of red contains 30% of bronze, and becomes coated with verdigris if exposed to damp. All this chemistry was empirical and acquired by instinct. Finding the necessary elements at hand, or being supplied with them from a distance, they made use of them at hazard, and without being too certain of obtaining the effects they sought. Many of their most harmonious combinations were due to accident, and they could not reproduce them at will. The masses which they obtained by these unscientific means were nevertheless of very considerable dimensions. The classic authors tell of stelae, sarcophagi, and columns made in one piece. Ordinarily, however, glass was used only for small objects, and above all for counterfeiting precious stones. However cheaply they may have been sold in the Egyptian market, these small objects were not accessible to all the world. The glass workers imitated the emerald, jasper, lapis lazuli, and carnelian to such perfection that even now we are sometimes embarrassed to distinguish the real stones from the false. The glass was pressed into moulds made of stone or limestone, cut to the forms required, as beads, discs, rings, pendants, rods, and plaques covered with figures of men and animals, gods and goddesses. Eyes and eyebrows for the faces of statues in stone or bronze were likewise made of glass, as also bracelets. Glass was inserted into the hollows of incised hieroglyphs, and the hieroglyphs were also cut out in glass. In this manner, whole inscriptions were composed and let into wood, stone, or metal. The two mummy cases, which enclose the body of Netemt, mother of the Pharaoh Herhor Semen, are decorated in this style. Except the headdress of the effigy and some minor details, these cases are gilded all over, the texts and principal part of the ornamentation being formed of glass enamels, which stand out in brilliant contrast with the dead gold ground. Many Fayum mummies are coated with plaster or stucco, the texts and religious designs, which are generally painted, being formed of glass enamels encrusted upon the surface of the plaster. Some of the largest subjects are made of pieces of glass joined together and retouched with the chisel, in imitation of bas-relief. Thus the face, hands, and feet of the goddess Ma are done in turquoise blue, her headdress in dark blue, her feather in alternate stripes of blue and yellow, and her raiment in deep red. Upon a wooden shrine recently discovered in the neighbourhood of Daphnae, and upon a fragment of mummy case in the Museum of Turin, the hieroglyphic forms of many coloured glass are inlaid upon the sombre ground of the wood, the general effect being inconceivably rich and brilliant. Glass filigrees, engraved glass, cut glass, soldered glass, glass imitations of wood, of straw, and of string, were all known to the Egyptians of old. I have under my hand at this present moment a square rod formed of innumerable threads of coloured glass fused into one solid body, which gives the royal oval of one of the Amenemhats at the part where it is cut through. The design is carried through the whole length of the rod, and wherever that rod may be cut, the royal oval appears. One glass case in the Gizeh Museum is entirely stocked with small objects in coloured glass. Here we see an ape on all fours, smelling some large fruit which lies upon the ground. Yonder a woman's head, front face, upon a white or green ground, surrounded by a red border. Most of the plaques represent only rosettes, stars, and single flowers or posies. One of the smallest represents a black and white apis walking, the work being so delicate that it loses none of its effect under the magnifying glass. The greater number of these objects date from and after the first Saïte dynasty, but excavations in Thebes and Tel el Amarna have proved that the manufacture of coloured glass prevailed in Egypt earlier than the 10th century before our era. At Kernet, Merayi, and Sheikh Abd el Gurneh, there have been found not only amulets for the use of the dead, such as colonnettes, hearts, mystic eyes, hippopotami walking erect, and ducks in pairs, done in parti-coloured pastes, red, blue, and yellow, but also vases of a type which we have been accustomed to regard as of Phoenician and Cypriot manufacture. Here, for example, is a little aenochoe of a light blue semi-opaque glass, the inscription in the name of Thothmes III, the ovals on the neck and the palm fronds on the body of the vase being in yellow. Here again is a lenticular phial, 3¼ inches in height, the ground colour of a deep ocean blue, admirably pure and intense, upon which a fern leaf pattern in yellow stands out both boldly and delicately. A yellow runs round the rim, and two little handles of light green are attached to the neck. A miniature amphora of the same height is of a dark, semi-transparent olive green. A zone of blue and yellow zigzags, bounded above and below by yellow bands, encircles the body of the vase at the part of its largest circumference. The handles are of pale green, and the thread around the lip is pale blue. Princess Nekhti Khonsû had beside her, in the vault at Deir el Bahari, some glass goblets of similar work. 7 were in whole colours, light green and blue. 4 were of black glass spotted with white. 1 only was decorated with many coloured fronds, arranged in 2 rows. The national glass works were therefore in full operation during the time of the great Theban dynasties. Huge piles of scoriae mixed with slag yet mark the spot where their furnaces were stationed, at Tel al Amara, the Ramesseum, at El Kab, and at the Tell of Eshmunian. The Egyptians also enamelled stone. One half at least of the scarabaei, cylinders, and amulets contained in our museums are of limestone or schist, covered with a coloured glaze. Doubtless the common clay seemed to them inappropriate to this kind of decoration, for they substituted in its place various sorts of earth, some white and sandy, another sort brown and fine, which they obtained by the pulverization of a particular kind of limestone found in the neighbourhood of Kenne, Luxor, and Aswan, and a third sort, reddish in tone, and mixed with powdered sandstone and brick dust. These various substances are known by the equally inexact names of Egyptian porcelain and Egyptian faïence. The older specimens, which are hardly glazed at all, are coated with an excessively thin slip. This vitreous matter has, however, generally settled into the hollows of the hieroglyphs or figures, where its lustre stands out in strong contrast with the dead surface of the surrounding parts. The colour most frequently in use under the ancient dynasties was green, but yellow, red, brown, violet, and blue were not disdained. Blue predominated in the Theban factories from the earliest beginning of the Middle Empire. This blue was brilliant, yet tender, in imitation of turquoise or lapis lazuli. The Gizeh Museum formerly contained 3 hippopotamuses of this shade, discovered in the tomb of Entef at Drah Ebel Negeh. One was lying down, the 2 others were standing in the marshes, their bodies being covered by the potter with pen and ink sketches of reeds and lotus plants, amid which hover birds and butterflies. This was his naive way of depicting the animal amid his natural surroundings. The blue is splendid, and we must overleap 20 centuries before we again find so pure a colour among the funerary statuettes of Deir el Bahari. Green reappears under the Sati dynasties, but paler than that of more ancient times, and it prevailed in the north of Egypt at Memphis, Bubastis, and Sais, without entirely banishing the blue. The other colours before mentioned were in current use for not more than 4 or 5 centuries, that is to say, from the time of Ahmes I to the time of the Ramessides. It was then, and only then, that a shabtu of white or red glaze, rosettes and lotus flowers in yellow, red, and violet, and parti-coloured coal pots abounded. The potters of the time of Amenhotep III affected greys and violets. The olive-shaped amulets, which are inscribed with the names of this pharaoh and the princesses of his family, are decorated with pale blue hieroglyphics upon a delicate mauve ground. The vase of Queen T in the Gizeh collection is of grey and blue, with ornaments in 2 colours round the neck. The fabrication of many-coloured enamels seems to have attained its greatest development under Khûenaten. At all events, it was at Tel al Amarna that I found the brightest and most delicately fashioned specimens, such as yellow, green, and violet rings, blue and white fleurettes, fish, lutes, figs, and bunches of grapes. One little statue of Horus has a red face and a blue body. A ring bezel bears the name of the king in violet upon a ground of light blue. However restricted the space, the various colours are laid in with so sure a hand that they never run one into the other, but stand out separately and vividly. A vase to contain antimony powder, chased and mounted on a pierced stand, is glazed with reddish brown. Another, in the shape of a mitred hawk, is blue, picked out with black spots. It belonged of old to Ahmes I. A third, hollowed out of the body of an energetic little hedgehog, is of a changeable green. A pharaoh's head in dead blue wears a klaft, with dark blue stripes. Fine as these pieces are, the chef d'oeuvre of the series is a statuette of one Tames, first prophet of Amen, now in the Gizeh Museum. The hieroglyphic inscriptions, as well as the details of the mummy bandages, are chased in relief upon a white ground of admirable smoothness, afterwards filled in with enamel. The face and hands are of turquoise blue. The headdress is yellow, with violet stripes. The hieroglyphic characters of the inscription, and the vulture with outspread wings upon the breast of the figure, are also violet. The whole is delicate, brilliant, and harmonious. Not a flaw mars the purity of the contours or the clearness of the lines. Glazed pottery was common from the earliest times. Cups with a foot, blue bowls rounded at the bottom and decorated in black ink with mystic eyes, lotus flowers, fishes, and palm leaves, date, as a rule, from the 18th, 19th, or 20th dynasties. Lenticular ampullae coated with a greenish glaze, flanked by 2 crouching monkeys for handles, decorated along the edge with pearl or egg-shaped ornaments, and round the body with elaborate collars, belong almost without exception to the reigns of Apries and Amasis. Sistrum handles, saucers, drinking cups in the form of half-blown lotus, plates, dishes, in short, all vessels in common use, were required to be not only easy to keep clean, but pleasant to look upon. Did they carry their taste for enamelled ware so far as to cover the walls of their houses with glazed tiles? Upon this point we can pronounce neither affirmatively nor negatively, the few examples of this kind of decoration which we possess being all from royal buildings. Upon a yellow brick we have the family name and car name of Pepi I. Upon a green brick the name of Rameses III. Upon certain red and white fragments the names of Seti I. and Sheshonq. Up to the present century, one of the chambers in the step pyramid at Saqqara yet retained its mural decoration of glazed ware. For 3/4 of the wall surface it was covered with green tiles, oblong in shape, flat at the back, and slightly convex on the face. A square tenon pierced through with a hole large enough to receive a wooden rod served to fix them together in horizontal pyramid of rows. The 3 rows which frame in the doorway are inscribed with the titles of an unclassed pharaoh belonging to one of the first Memphite dynasties. The hieroglyphs are relieved in blue, red, green, and yellow, upon a tawny ground. 20 centuries later, Rameses III originated a new style at Tel el Yaouadeh. This time the question of ornamentation concerned not a single chamber, but a whole temple. The mass of the building was of limestone and alabaster, but the pictorial subjects, instead of being sculptured according to the custom, were of a kind of mosaic made with almost equal parts of stone tesserae and glazed ware. The most frequent item in the scheme of decoration was a roundel, moulded on a sandy frit, coated with blue or grey slip, upon which is a cream-coloured rosette. Some of these rosettes are framed in geometrical designs, or spiderweb patterns. Some represent open flowers. The central boss is in relief. The petals and tracery are encrusted in the mass. These roundels, which are of various diameters, ranging from 3/8 of an inch to 4 inches, were fixed to the walls by means of a very fine cement. They were used to form many different designs, as scrolls, foliage, and parallel fillets, such as may be seen on the foot of an altar and the base of a column preserved in the Gizeh Museum. The royal ovals were mostly in one piece, so also were the figures. The details either incised or modelled upon the clay before firing were afterwards painted with such colours as might be suitable. The lotus flowers and leaves which were carried along the bottom of the walls, or the length of the cornices, were, on the contrary, made up of independent pieces, each colour being a separate morsel cut to fit exactly into the pieces by which it was surrounded. This temple was rifled at the beginning of the present century, and some figures of prisoners brought thence have been in the Louvre collection ever since the time of Champollion. All that remained of the building and its decoration was demolished a few years ago by certain dealers in antiquities, and the debris are now dispersed in all directions. Mariette, though with great difficulty, recovered some of the more important fragments, such as the name of Rameses III, which dates the building, some borderings of lotus flowers and birds with human hands, and some heads of Asiatic and Negro prisoners. The destruction of this monument is the more grievous, because the Egyptians cannot have constructed many after the same type. Glazed bricks, painted tiles, and enamelled mosaics are readily injured, and in the judgment of a people enamoured of stability and eternity, that would be the gravest of radical defects. End of Chapter 5, Section 1. Recording by Timothy Ferguson, Gold Coast, Australia. Chapter 5, Section 2 of Manual of Egyptian Archaeology and Guide to the Study of Antiquities in Egypt by Gaston Maspero. Translated by Amelia B. Edwards. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Timothy Ferguson. Chapter 5, The Industrial Arts. Section 2, Wood, Ivory, Leather, and Textile Fabrics. Objects in ivory, bone, and horn are among the rarities of our museums, but we must not, for this reason, conclude that the Egyptians did not make ample use of those substances. Horn is perishable, and is eagerly devoured by certain insects, which rapidly destroy it. Bone and ivory soon deteriorate, and become friable. The elephant was known to the Egyptians from the remotest period. They may, perhaps, have found it inhabiting the Thebaid, when first they established themselves in that part of the Nile Valley. For as early as the 5th dynasty we find the pictured form of the elephant in use as the hieroglyphic name of the island of Elephantine. Ivory in tusks and half-tusks was imported into Egypt from the regions of the Upper Nile. It was sometimes dyed green or red but was generally left of its natural colour. It was largely employed by cabinet makers for inlaying furniture, as chairs, bedsteads, and coffers. Combs, dice, hairpins, toilette ornaments, delicately wrought spoons, coal bottles hollowed out of a miniature column surmounted by a capital, incense burners in the shape of a hand supporting a bronze cup in which the perfumes were burned, and boomerangs engraved with the figures of the gods and fantastic animals were also made of ivory. Some of these objects are works of fine art, as for instance at Gizeh a poignard handle in the form of a lion, the plaques in bas-relief which adorn the draught box of one Tuai, who lived towards the end of the 17th dynasty, a 5th dynasty figure unfortunately mutilated, which yet retains traces of rose colour, and a miniature statue of Abi, who died at the time of the 13th dynasty. This little personage, perched on the top of a lotus flower column, looks straight before him with a majestic air, which contrasts somewhat comically with the size and prominence of his ears. The modelling of the figure is broad and spirited, and will bear comparison with good Italian ivories of the Renaissance period. Egypt produces few trees, and of these few the greater number are useless to the sculptor. The two which most abound, namely the date palm and the dom palm, are too coarse of fibre for carving, and are too unequal in texture. Some varieties of the sycamore and acacia are the only trees of which the grain is sufficiently fine and manageable to be wrought with the chisel. Wood was nevertheless a favourite material for cheap and rapid work. It was even employed at times for subjects of importance, such as car statues, and the wooden man of Gizeh shows with what boldness and amplitude of style it could be treated. But the blocks and beams which the Egyptians had at command were seldom large enough for a statue. The wooden man himself, though but half size, consists of a number of pieces held together by square pegs. Hence wood carvers were wont to treat their subjects upon such a scale as admitted of their being cut in one block, and the statues of olden time became statuettes under the Theban dynasties. Art lost nothing by the reduction, and more than one of these little figures is comparable to the finest works of the ancient empire. The best, perhaps, is at the Turin Museum, and dates from the 20th dynasty. It represents a young girl whose only garment is a slender girdle. She is of that indefinite age when the undeveloped form is almost as much like that of a boy as of a girl. The expression of the head is gentle yet saucy. It is, in fact, across 30 centuries of time, a portrait of one of those graceful little maidens of Elephantine who, without immodesty or embarrassment, walk unclothed in sight of strangers. 3 little wooden men in the Gizeh Museum are probably contemporaries of the Turin figure. They wear full dress, as indeed they should, for one was a king's favourite, named Hori, and surnamed Ra. They are walking with calm and measured tread, the bust thrown forward and the head high. The expression upon their faces is knowing and somewhat sly. An officer who has retired on half pay at the Louvre wears an undress uniform of the time of Amenhotep III, that is to say, a small wig, a close-fitting vest with short sleeves, and a kilt drawn tightly over the hips, reaching scarcely halfway down the thigh, and trimmed in front with a piece of puffing plaited longwise. His companion is a priest, who wears his hair in rows of little curls, one above the other, and is clad in a long petticoat, falling below the calf of the leg, and spreading out in front in a kind of plaited apron. He holds a sacred standard consisting of a stout staff, surmounted by a ram's head, crowned with the solar disk. Both officer and priest are painted red-brown, with the exception of the hair, which is black, the cornea of the eyes, which is white, and the standard, which is yellow. Curiously enough, the little Lady Nai, who inhabits the same glass case, is also painted reddish-brown, instead of buff, which was the canonical colour for women. She is taken in a close-fitting garment trimmed down the front with a band of white embroidery. Round her neck she wears a necklace consisting of a triple row of gold pendants. 2 golden bracelets adorn her wrists, and on her head she carries a wig with long curls. The right arm hangs by her side, the hand holding some object now lost, which was probably a mirror. The left arm is raised, and with the left hand she presses a lotus lily to her breast. The body is easy and well formed. The figure indicates youth. The face is open, smiling, pleasant, and somewhat plebeian. To modify the unwieldy mass of the headdress was beyond the skill of the artist, but the bust is delicately and elegantly modelled. The clinging garment gives discreet emphasis to the shape, and the action of the hand which holds the flower is rendered with grace and naturalness. All these are portraits, and as the sitters were not persons of august rank, we may conclude that they did not employ the most fashionable artists. They doubtless had recourse to more unpretending craftsmen, but that such craftsmen were thus highly trained in knowledge of form and accuracy of execution shows how strongly even the artisan was influenced by the great school of sculpture which then flourished at Thebes. This influence becomes even more apparent when we study the knick-knacks of the toilet table, and such small objects as, properly speaking, come under the head of furniture. To pass in review the 101 little articles of female ornament or luxury to which the fancy of the designer gave all kinds of ingenious and novel forms would be no light task. The handles of mirrors, for instance, generally represented a stem of lotus or papyrus surmounted by a full-blown flower, from the midst of which rose a disc of polished metal. For this design is sometimes substituted the figure of a young girl, either nude or clad in a close-fitting garment, who holds the mirror on her head. The tops of hairpins were carved in the semblance of a coiled serpent, or of the head of a jackal, a dog, or a hawk. The pin cushion in which they are placed is a hedgehog or a tortoise, with holes pierced in a formal pattern upon the back. The headrests, which served for pillows, were decorated with bas-reliefs of subjects derived from the myths of Bes and Sekhet, the grimacing features of the former deity being carved on the ends or on the base. But it is in the carving of perfume spoons and coal bottles that the inventive skill of the craftsman is most brilliantly displayed. Not to soil their fingers, the Egyptians made use of spoons for essences, pomades, and the variously coloured preparations with which both men and women stained their cheeks, lips, eyelids, nails, and palms. The designer generally borrowed his subjects from the fauna or flora of the Nile Valley. A little case at Gizeh is carved in the shape of a couchant calf, the body being hollowed out, and the head and back forming a removable lid. A spoon in the same collection represents a dog running away with an enormous fish in his mouth, the body of the fish forming the bowl of the spoon. Another shows a cartouche springing from a full-blown lotus, another a lotus fruit laid upon a bouquet of flowers, and here is a simple triangular bowl, the handle decorated with a stem and two buds. The most elaborate specimens combine these subjects with a human figure. A young girl, clad in a mere girdle, is represented in the act of swimming. Her head is well lifted above the water, and her outstretched arms support a duck, the body of which is hollowed out, while the wings, being movable, serve as a cover. We have also a young girl in the Louvre collection, but she stands in a maze of lotus plants, and is in the act of gathering a bud. A bunch of stems, from which emerge two full-blown blossoms, unites the handle to the bowl of the spoon, which is in reverse position, the larger end being turned outwards and the point inwards. Elsewhere, a young girl, playing upon a long-necked lute as she trips along, is framed in by two flowering stems. Sometimes the fair musician is standing upright in a tiny skiff, and sometimes a girl bearing offerings is substituted for the lute player. Another example represents a slave toiling under the weight of an enormous sack. The age and physiognomy of each of these personages is clearly indicated. The lotus gatherer is of good birth, as may be seen by her carefully plaited hair and tunic. The Theban ladies wore long robes, but this damsel has gathered up her skirts that she may thread her way among the reeds without wetting her garments. The two musicians and the swimming girl belong, on the contrary, to an inferior or servile class. Two of them wear only a girdle, and the third has a short garment negligently fastened. The bearer of offerings wears the long pendant tresses distinctive of childhood, and is one of those slender growing girls of the fellahin class whom one sees in such numbers on the banks of the Nile. Her lack of clothing is, however, no evidence of want of birth, for not even the children of nobility were wont to put on the garments of their sex before the period of adolescence. Lastly, the slave with his thick lips, his high shoulders, his flat nose, his heavy animal jaw, his low brow, and his bare conical head is evidently a caricature of some foreign prisoner. The dogged sullenness with which he trudges under his burden is admirably caught, while the angularities of the body, the type of the head, and the general arrangement of the parts remind one of the terracotta grotesques of Asia Minor. In these subjects, all the minor details, the fruits, the flowers, the various kinds of birds, are rendered with much more truth and cleverness. Of the three ducks which are tied by the feet and slung over the arms of the girl bearing offerings, Two are resigned to their fate, and hang swinging, with open eyes and outstretched necks, but the third flaps her wings and lifts her head protestingly. The two small waterfowl, perched upon the lotus flowers, listen placidly to the lute player's music, their beaks resting on their crops. They have learned by experience not to put themselves out of the way for a song, and they know that there is nothing to fear from a young girl unless she is armed. They are put to flight in the bas relief by the mere sight of a bow and arrows, just as a company of rooks is put to flight nowadays by the sight of a gun. The Egyptians were especially familiar with the ways of animals and birds, and reproduced them with marvellous exactness. The habit of minutely observing minor facts became instinctive, and it informed their most trifling works with that air of reality which strikes us so forcibly at the present day. Household furniture was no more abundant in ancient Egypt than it is in the Egypt of to-day. In the time of the 12th dynasty, an ordinary house contained no bedsteads, but low frameworks like the Nubian angareb, or mats rolled up by day, on which the owners lay down at night in their clothes, pillowing their heads on earthenware, stone, or wooden headrests. There were also 2 or 3 simple stone seats, some wooden chairs or stools with carved legs, chests and boxes of various sizes for clothes and tools, and a few common vessels of pottery or bronze. For making fire there were fire sticks, and the bow drill for using them. Children's toys were even then found in great variety, though of somewhat quaint construction. There were dolls with wigs and movable limbs, made in stone, pottery, and wood, figures of men and animals and terracotta boats, balls of wood and stuffed leather, whip tops, and tipcats. The art of the cabinet maker was nevertheless carried to a high degree of perfection from the time of the ancient dynasties. Planks were dressed down with the adze, mortised, glued, joined together by means of pegs cut in hard wood or acacia thorns, never metal nails, polished and finally covered with paintings. Chests generally stand upon 4 straight legs, and are occasionally thus raised to some height from the ground. The lid is flat or rounded according to a special curvature, much in favour amongst the Egyptians of all periods. Sometimes, though rarely, it is gable-shaped like our house roofs. Generally speaking, the lid lifts off bodily, but it often turns upon a peg inserted in one of the uprights. Sometimes also it turns upon wooden pivots. The panels, which are large and admirably suited for the decorative art, are enriched with paintings or inlaid with ivory, silver, precious woods, or enamelled plaques. It may be that we are scarcely in a position to justly appraise the skill of Egyptian cabinet makers, or the variety of designs produced at various periods. Nearly all the furniture which has come down to our day has been found in tombs, and being destined for burial in the sepulchre, may either be of a character exclusively destined for the use of the mummy, or possibly a cheap imitation of a more precious class of goods. The mummy was, in fact, the cabinet maker's best customer. In other lands, man took but a few objects with him into the next world, but the defunct Egyptian required nothing short of a complete outfit. The mummy case alone was an actual monument, in the construction of which a whole squad of workmen was employed. The styles of mummy cases varied from period to period. Under the Memphite and first Theban empires, we find only rectangular chests in sycamore wood, flat at top and bottom, and made of many pieces joined together by wooden pins. The pattern is not elegant, but the decoration is very curious. The lid has no cornice. Outside, it is inscribed down the middle with a long column of hieroglyphs, sometimes merely written in ink, sometimes laid on in colour, sometimes carved in hollowed-out signs filled in with some kind of bluish paste. The inscription records only the name and titles of the deceased, accompanied now and then by a short form of prayer in his favour. The inside is covered with a thick coat of stucco, or whitewash. Upon this surface, the 17th chapter of the Book of the Dead was generally written in red and black inks, and in fine cursive hieroglyphs. The body of the chest is made with 3 horizontal planks for the bottom, and 8 vertical planks placed 2 and 2 for the 4 sides. The outside is sometimes decorated with long strips of various colours, ending in interlaced lotus leaves, such as are seen on stone sarcophagi. More frequently, it is ornamented on the left side with 2 wide open eyes and 2 monumental doors, and on the right side with 3 doors, exactly like those seen in contemporary catacombs. The sarcophagus is in truth the house of the deceased, and, being his house, its 4 walls were bound to contain an epitome of the prayers and tableaux which covered the walls of his tomb. The necessary formulae and pictured scenes were, therefore, reproduced inside, nearly in the same order in which they appear in the mastabas. Each side is divided in 3 registers, each register containing a dedication in the name of the deceased, or representations of objects belonging to him, or such texts from the ritual as need to be repeated for his benefit. Skilfully composed and painted upon a background made to imitate some precious wood, the whole forms a boldly designed and harmoniously coloured picture. The cabinet maker's share of the work was the lightest, and the long boxes in which the dead of the earliest period were buried made no great demand upon his skill. This, however, was not the case when, in later times, the sarcophagus came to be fashioned in the likeness of the human body. Of this style we have 2 leading types. In the most ancient, the mummy serves as the model for his case. His outstretched feet and hands are in one. The form of the knee, the swell of the calf, the contours of the thigh, and the trunk are summarily indicated, and are, as it were, vaguely modelled under the wood. The head, apparently the only living part of this inert body, is wrought out in the round. The dead man is, in this wise, imprisoned in a kind of statue of himself, and this statue is so well balanced that it can stand on its feet, if required, as upon a pedestal. In the other type of sarcophagus, the deceased lies at full length upon his tomb, and his figure, sculptured in the round, serves as the lid of his mummy case. On his head is seen the ponderous wig of the period. A white linen vest and a long petticoat cover his chest and legs. His feet are shod with elegant sandals. His arms lie straight along his sides, or are folded upon his breast, the hands grasping various emblems, as the ankh, the girdle buckle, the tat, or, as in the case of the wife of Senetmu of Gizeh, a garland of ivy. This mummiform type of sarcophagus is rarely met with under the Memphite dynasties, though that of Menkaura, the Mycerinus of the Greeks, affords a memorable example. Under the 11th dynasty, the mummy case is frequently but a hollow tree trunk, roughly sculptured outside, with a head at one end and feet at the other. The face is daubed with bright colours, yellow, red, and green. The wig and headdress are striped with black and blue, and an elaborate collar is depicted on the breast. The rest of the case is either covered with the long gilded wings of Isis and Nephthys, or with a uniform tint of white or yellow, and sparsely decorated with symbolic figures, or columns of hieroglyphs painted blue and black. Among the sarcophagi belonging to the kings of the 17th dynasty, which are recovered from Deir el-Bahari, the most highly finished belonged to this type, and were only remarkable of the really extraordinary skill with which the craftsmen had reproduced the features of the deceased sovereigns. The mask of Ahmes I, that of Amenhotep I, and that of Thosmes II are masterpieces in their way. The mask of Rameses II shows no sign of paint, except a black line which accentuates the form of the eye. The face is doubtless modelled in the likeness of the pharaoh Herhor, who restored the funerary outfit of his puissant ancestor, and it will almost bear comparison with the best works of contemporary sculpture. 2 mummy cases found in the same place, namely those of Queen Ahmes-Nefertari and her daughter Ahotep II, are of gigantic size, and measure more than 10½ feet in height. Standing upright, they might almost be taken for 2 of the caryatid statues from the first court of Medinet Habu, though on a smaller scale. The bodies are represented as bandaged, and but vaguely indicate the contours of the human form. The shoulders and bust of each are covered with a kind of network in relief, every mesh standing out in blue upon a yellow ground. The hands emerge from this mantle, are crossed upon the breast, and grasp the ankh, or Tau cross, symbolic of eternal life. The heads are portraits. The faces are round, the eyes large, the expression mild and characterless. Each is crowned with the flat-topped cap and lofty plumes of Amen, or Maut. We cannot but wonder for what reason these huge receptacles were made. The 2 queens were small in stature, and their mummies, which were well nigh lost in the cases, had to be packed round with an immense quantity of rags to prevent them from shifting and becoming injured. Apart from their abnormal size, these cases are characterized by the same simplicity which distinguishes other mummy cases of royal or private persons of the same period. Towards the middle of the 19th dynasty, the fashion changed. The single mummy case, soberly decorated, was superseded by 2, 3, and even 4 cases, fitting the one into the other, and covered with paintings and inscriptions. Sometimes the outer receptacle is a sarcophagus with convex lid and square ears, upon which the deceased is pictured over and over again upon a white ground, in adoration before the gods of the Assyrian cycle. When, however, it is shaped in human form, it retains somewhat of the old simplicity. The face is painted, a collar is represented on the chest, a band of hieroglyphs extends down the whole length of the body to the feet, and the rest is one uniform tone of black, brown, or dark yellow. The inner cases were extravagantly rich, the hands and faces being red, rose-coloured, or gilded, the jewellery painted, or sometimes imitated by means of small morsels of enamel encrusted in the woodwork. The surfaces frequently covered with many-coloured scenes and legends, and the whole heightened by means of the yellow varnish already mentioned. The lavish ornamentation of this period is in striking contrast with the sobriety of earlier times; but in order to grasp the reason of this change, one must go to Thebes and visit the actual sepulchres of the dead. The kings and private persons of the great conquering dynasties devoted their energies and all the means at their disposal to the excavation of catacombs. The walls of these catacombs were covered with sculptures and paintings. The sarcophagus was cut in one enormous block of granite or alabaster, and admirably wrought. It was, therefore, of little moment if the wooden coffin in which the mummy reposed was simply decorated. But the Egyptians of the decadence and their rulers had not the wealth of Egypt and the spoils of neighbouring countries at command. They were poor, and the slenderness of their resources debarred them from great undertakings. They, for the most part, gave up the preparation of magnificent tombs, and employed such wealth as remained to them in the fabrication of fine mummy cases carved in sycamore wood. The beauty of their coffins, therefore, but affords an additional proof of their weakness and poverty. When, for a few centuries, the Sati princes had succeeded in re-establishing the prosperity of the country, stone sarcophagi came once more into requisition, and the wooden coffin reverted to somewhat of the simplicity of the great period. But this renaissance was not destined to last. The Macedonian conquest brought back the same revolution in funerary fashions which followed the fall of the Ramessides, and double and triple mummy cases, over-painted and over-gilded, were once again in demand. If the craftsmen of Greco-Roman time, who attired the dead of Ekhmim for their last resting places, were less skilful than those of earlier date, their bad taste was, at all events, not surpassed by the Theban coffin makers who lived and worked under the latest princes of the royal line of Rameses. A series of Greco-Roman examples from the Fayûm exhibit the stages by which portraiture in the flat there replaced the modelled mask, until towards the middle of the 2nd century A.D. it became customary to bandage over the face of the mummy a panel portrait of the dead as he was in life. The remainder of the funerary outfit supplied the cabinet maker with as much work as the coffin maker. Boxes of various shapes and sizes were required for the wardrobe of the mummy, for his viscera, and for his funerary statuettes. He must also have tables for his meals, stools, chairs, a bed to lie upon, a boat and sledge to convey him to the tomb, and sometimes even a war chariot and a carriage in which to take to the air. The boxes for canopic vases, funerary statuettes, and libation vases are divided in several compartments. A couchant jackal is sometimes placed on top, and it serves for a handle by which to take off the lid. Each box was provided with its own little sledge, upon which it was drawn in the funeral procession on the day of burial. Beds are not very uncommon. Many are identical in structure with the Nubian angarebs, and consist merely of some coarse fabric, or of some interlaced strips of leather stretched on a plain wooden frame. Few exceed 56 inches in length. The sleeper therefore could never lie outstretched, but must perforce assume a doubled-up position. The frame is generally horizontal, but sometimes it slopes slightly downwards from the head to the foot. It was often raised to a considerable height above the level of the floor, and a stool or a little portable set of steps was used in mounting it. These details were known to us by the wall paintings only, until I myself discovered two perfect specimens in 1884 and 1885, one in Thebes in a tomb of the 13th dynasty, and the other at Ekhmim in the Greco-Roman necropolis. In the former, two accommodating lions have elongated their bodies to form the framework, their heads doing the duty for the head of the bed, and their tails being curled up under the feet of the sleeper. The bed is surmounted by a kind of canopy, under which the mummy lay in state. Rhind has already found a similar canopy, which is now in the Museum of Edinburgh. In shape it is a temple, the rounded roof being supported by elegant colonnettes of painted wood. A doorway guarded by serpents is supposed to give access to the miniature edifice. 3 winged discs, each larger than the one below it, adorn 3 superimposed cornices above the door, the whole frontage being surmounted with a row of erect uraei crowned with the solar disc. The canopy belonging to the 13th dynasty bed is much more simple, being a mere balustrade in cut and painted wood, in imitation of the water pattern with which temple walls were decorated. The whole is crowned with an ordinary cornice. In the bed of Greco-Roman date, carved and painted figures of the goddess Ma, sitting with her feather on her knee, are substituted for the customary balustrades. Isis and Nephthys stand with their winged arms outstretched at the head and foot. The roof is open, save for a row of vultures hovering above the mummy, which is wept over by two kneeling statuettes of Isis and Nephthys, one at each end. The sledges upon which the mummies were dragged to the sepulchre were also furnished with canopies, but in a totally different style. The sledge canopy is a panelled shrine, like those which I discovered in 1886 in the tomb of Senetmu at Kernet Murray. If light was admitted, it came through a square opening, showing the head of the mummy within. Wilkinson gives an illustration of a sledge canopy of this kind, from the wall paintings of a Theban tomb. The panels were always made to slide. As soon as the mummy was laid upon his sledge, the panels were closed, the cornice roof placed over all, and the whole closed in. With regard to chairs, many of those in the Louvre and the British Museum were made about the time of the 11th dynasty. These are not the least beautiful specimens which have come down to us, one in particular having preserved an extraordinary brilliancy of colour. The framework, formerly fitted with a seat of strong netting, was originally supported on 4 legs with lion's feet. The back is ornamental with 2 lotus flowers, and with a row of lozenges inlaid in ivory and ebony, upon a red ground. Stools of similar workmanship, and folding stools, the feet of which are in the form of a goose's head, may be seen in all museums. Pharaohs and persons of high rank affected more elaborate designs. Their seats were sometimes raised very high, the arms being carved to resemble running lions, and the lower supports being prisoners of war, bound back to back. A footboard in front served as a step to mount by, and as a footstool for the sitter. Up to the present time we found no specimens of this kind of seat. We learn from the tomb paintings that netted or caned bottom chairs were covered with stuffed seats and richly worked cushions. These cushions and stuffed seats have perished, but it is to be concluded that they were covered with tapestry. Tapestry was undoubtedly known to the Egyptians, and a bas-relief subject at Beni Hassan shows the process of weaving. The frame, which is of the simplest structure, resembles that now in use among the weavers of Ekhmim. It is horizontal, and is formed of 2 slender cylinders, or rather of 2 rods, about 54 inches apart, each held in place by 2 large pegs, driven into the ground about 3 feet distant from each other. The warps of the chain were strongly fastened, then rolled round the top cylinder till they were stretched sufficiently tight. Mill sticks placed at certain distances facilitated the insertion of the needles which carried the thread. As in the Goblin's factory, the work was begun from the bottom. The texture was regulated and equalized by means of a coarse comb, and was rolled upon the lower cylinder as it increased in length. Hangings and carpets were woven in this manner, some with figures, others with geometrical designs, zigzags, and checkers. A careful examination of the monuments has, however, convinced me that most of the subjects hitherto supposed to represent examples of tapestry represent in fact examples of cut and painted leather. The leather worker's craft flourished in ancient Egypt. Few museums are without a pair of leather sandals or a specimen of mummy braces with ends of stamped leather, bearing the effigy of a god, a pharaoh, a hieroglyphic legend, a rosette, or perhaps all combined. These little relics are not older than the time of the priest kings, or the earlier Bubastites. It is to the same period that we must attribute the great cut leather canopy in the Gizeh Museum. The catafalque upon which the mummy was laid when transported from the mortuary establishment to the tomb was frequently adorned with a covering made of stuff or soft leather. Sometimes the side pieces hung down, and sometimes they were drawn aside with bands, like curtains, which showed the coffin. The canopy at Deir el Bahri was made for the princess Isiemkeb, daughter of the high priest Mahesierti, wife of the high priest Menkapura, and mother of the high priest Pinotem III. The centrepiece, in shape an oblong square, is divided into 3 bands of sky blue leather, now faded to pearl grey. The 2 side pieces are sprinkled with yellow stars. Upon the middle piece are rows of vultures, whose outspread wings protect the mummy. 4 other pieces covered with red and green checkers are attached to the ends and sides. The longer pieces which hung over the sides are united to the centrepiece by an ornamental bordering. On the right, scarabaei with extended wings alternate with the cartouches of King Pinotem II, and are surmounted by a lance head frieze. On the left side the pattern is more complicated. In the centre we see a bunch of lotus lilies flanked by royal cartouches. Next come two antelopes, each kneeling upon a basket; then two bouquets of papyrus; then two more scarabaei, similar to those upon the other border. The lance head frieze finishes it above, as on the opposite side. The technical process is very curious. The hieroglyphs and figures were cut out from large pieces of leather; then, under the open spaces thus left, were sewn thongs of leather of whatever colour was required for those ornaments of hieroglyphs. Finally, in order to hide the patchwork effect presented at the back, the whole was lined with long strips of white or light yellow leather. Despite the difficulties of treatment which this work presented, the result is most remarkable. The outlines of the gazelles, scarabaei, and flowers are as clean cut and as elegant as if drawn with the pen upon a wool surface or a page of papyrus. The choice of subjects is happy, and the colours employed are both lively and harmonious. The craftsman who designed and executed the canopy of Isiemkheb had profited by a long experience of this system of decoration, and of the kind of pattern suitable to the material. For my own part, I have not the slightest doubt that the cushions of chairs and royal couches, and the sails of funeral and sacred boats used for transport of mummies and divine images, were most frequently made in leatherwork. The checker pattern sail represented in one of the boat subjects painted on the wall of a chamber in the tomb of Rameses III. Might be mistaken for one of the side pieces of the canopy at Gizeh. The vultures and fantastic birds depicted upon the sails of another boat are neither more strange nor more difficult to make in cut leather than the vultures and gazelles of Isiemkheb. We have it upon the authority of ancient writers that the Egyptians of olden time embroidered as skilfully as those of the Middle Ages. The surcoats given by Amasis, one to the Lacedaemonians and the other to the temple of Athena at Lindos, were of linen embroidered with figures of animals in gold thread and purple, each thread consisting of 365 distinct filaments. To go back to a still earlier period, the monumental tableaux show portraits of the pharaohs wearing garments with borders, either woven or embroidered, or done in appliqué work. The most simple patterns consist of one or more stripes of brilliant colour parallel with the edge of the material. Elsewhere we see palm patterns, or rows of discs and points, leaf patterns, meanders, and even, here and there, figures of men, gods, or animals, worked most probably with the needle. None of the textile materials yet found upon royal mummies are thus decorated. We are therefore unable to pronounce upon the quality of this work, or the method employed in its production. Once only upon the body of one of the Deir el Bahari princesses did I find a royal cartouche embroidered in pale rose colour. The Egyptians of the best period seem to have attached special value to plain stuffs, and especially to white ones. These they wove with marvellous skill, and upon looms in every respect identical with those used in tapestry work. Those portions of the winding sheet of Thothmes III which enfold the royal hands and arms are as fine as the finest India muslin, and as fairly merit the name of woven air as the gauzes of the island of Kos. This, of course, is a mere question of manufacture, apart from the domain of art. Embroideries and tapestries were not commonly used in Egypt till about the end of the Persian period, or the beginning of the period of Greek rule. Alexandria became partly peopled by Phoenician, Syrian, and Jewish colonists, who brought with them the methods of manufacture particular to their own countries, and founded workshops which soon developed into flourishing establishments. It is to the Alexandrians that Pliny ascribes the invention of weaving with several warps, thus producing the stuff called brocades (polymita). And in the time of the first Caesars it was a recognised fact that "the needle of Babylon was henceforth surpassed by the comb of the Nile." The Alexandrian tapestries were not made after exclusively geometrical designs, like the product of the old Egyptian looms, but, according to the testimony of the ancients, were enriched with figures of animals and even of men. Of the masterpieces which adorned the palaces of the Ptolemies, no specimens remain. Many fragments which may be attributed to the later Roman time have, however, been found in Egypt, such as the piece with the boy and goose, described by Wilkinson, and a piece representing marine divinities, bought by myself at Coptos. The numerous embroidered winding sheets with woven borders which have recently been discovered near Ekhmim and in the Fayum are nearly all from Coptic tombs, and are more nearly akin to Byzantine art than to the art of Egypt. End of Chapter 5, Section 2. Recording by Timothy Ferguson, Gold Coast, Australia. Chapter 5, Part 3 of Manual of Egyptian Archaeology and Guide to the Study of Antiquities in Egypt by Gaston Maspero. Translated by Amelia B. Edwards. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Timothy Ferguson. Chapter 5, The Industrial Arts. Section 3, Metals. The Egyptians classified metals under two heads, namely the noble metals as gold, electrum, and silver, and the base metals as copper, iron, lead, and at a later period, tin. The two lists are divided by the mention of certain kinds of precious stones, such as lapis lazuli and malachite. Iron was reserved for weapons of war, and tools in use for hard substances, such as sculptors' and masons' chisels, axe and adze heads, knife blades, and saws. Lead was comparatively useless, but was sometimes used for inlaying temple doors, coffers, and furniture. Also, small statuettes of gods were occasionally made in this metal, especially those of Osiris and Anubis. Copper was too yielding to be available for objects in current use. Bronze, therefore, was the favourite metal of the Egyptians. Though often affirmed, it is not true that they succeeded in tempering bronze so that it became as hard as iron or steel, but by varying the constituents and their relative proportions, they were able to give it a variety of very different qualities. Most of these objects hitherto analysed have yielded precisely the same quantities of copper and tin commonly used by the bronze founders of the present day. Those analysed by Vauquelin in 1825 contained 84% of copper, 14% of tin, and 1% of iron and other substances. A chisel brought from Egypt by Sir Gardner Wilkinson contained only from 5 to 9% of tin, 1% of iron, and 94% of copper. Certain fragments of statuettes and mirrors, more recently subjected to analysis, have yielded a notable quantity of gold and silver, thus corresponding with the bronzes of Corinth. Other specimens resemble brass, both in their colour and substance. Many of the best Egyptian bronzes offer a surprising resistance to damp, and oxidise with difficulty. While yet hot from the mould, they were rubbed with some kind of resinous varnish, which filled up the pores and deposited an unalterable patina upon the surface. Each kind of bronze had its special use. The ordinary bronze was employed for weapons and common amulets. The brazen alloys served for household utensils. The bronzes mixed with gold and silver were destined only for mirrors, costly weapons, and statuettes of value. In none of the tomb paintings which I have seen is there any representation of bronze founding or bronze working, but this omission is easily supplemented by the objects themselves. Tools, arms, rings, and cheap vases were sometimes forged, and sometimes cast whole in moulds of hard clay or stone. Works of art were cast in one or several pieces according to circumstances. The parts were then united, soldered, and retouched with the burin. The method most frequently employed was to prepare a core of mixed clay and charcoal, or sand, which roughly reproduced the modelling of the mould into which it was introduced. The layer of metal between this core and the mould was often so thin that it would have yielded to any moderate pressure, had they not taken the precaution to consolidate it by having the core for a support. Domestic utensils and small household instruments were mostly made in bronze. Such objects are exhibited by thousands in our museums, and frequently figure in bas-reliefs and mural paintings. Art and trade were not incompatible in Egypt, and even the coppersmith sought to give elegance of form, and to add ornaments in a good style to the humblest of his works. The saucepan in which the cook of Rameses III concocted his masterpieces is supported on lion's feet. Here is a hot water jug which looks as if it were precisely like its modern successors, but on a closer examination we shall find that the handle is a full-blown lotus, the petals, which are bent over at an angle to the stalk, resting against the edge of the neck. The handles of knives and spoons are almost always in the form of a duck's or goose's neck, slightly curved. The bowl is sometimes fashioned like an animal, as, for instance, a gazelle ready bound for the sacrifice. On the hilt of a sabre we find a little crouching jackal, and the larger limb of a pair of scissors in the Gizeh Museum is made in the likeness of an Asiatic captive, his arms tied behind his back. A lotus leaf forms the disc of a mirror, and its stem is the handle. One perfume box is a fish, another is a bird, another is a grotesque deity. The lustration vases, or situlae, carried by priests and priestesses for the purpose of sprinkling either the faithful or the ground traversed by religious processions, merit the special consideration of connoisseurs. They are ovoid or pointed at the bottom, and decorated with subjects either chased or in relief. These sometimes represent deities, each in a separate frame, and sometimes scenes of worship. The work is generally very minute. Bronze came into use for statuary purposes from a very early period, but time unfortunately has preserved none of those idols which peopled the temples of the ancient empire. Whatsoever may be said to the contrary, we possess no bronze statuettes of any period anterior to the expulsion of the Hyksos. Some Theban figures date quite certainly from the 18th and 19th dynasties. The chased lion's head found with the jewels of Queen Aahhotep, the Hippocrates of Gizeh, inscribed with the names of Kamez and Ahmes I, and several statuettes of Amen, said to have been discovered at Medinet Habu and Sheikh Abd el Gurneh, are of that period. Our most important bronzes belong, however, to the 22nd dynasty, or later still, to the time of the Saïte pharaohs. Many are not older than the first Ptolemies. A fragment found in the ruins of Tanis, and now in the possession of Count Strogonoff, formed part of a votive statue dedicated by King Pisebkanu. It was originally 2/3 the size of life, and is the largest specimen known. A portrait statue of the Lady Takoshet, given to the Museum of Athens by Monsieur Demetrio, the 4 statuettes from the Posno collection now at the Louvre, and the kneeling genius of Gizeh, are all from the site of Bubastis, and date probably from the years which immediately preceded the accession of Psammetichus I. The Lady Takoshet is left standing, the left foot advanced, the right arm hanging down, the left raised and brought close to the body. She wears a short robe embroidered with religious subjects, and has bracelets on her arms and wrists. Upon her head she has a wig with flat curls, row above row. The details both of her robe and jewels are engraved in incised lines upon the surface of the bronze, and inlaid with silver threads. The face is evidently a portrait, and represents a woman of mature age. The form, according to the traditions of Egyptian art, is that of a younger woman, slender, firm, and supple. The copper in this bronze is largely intermixed with gold, thus producing a chastened lustre which is admirably suited to the richness of the embroidered garment. The kneeling genius of Gizeh is as rude and repellent as Lady Takoshet is delicate and harmonious. He has a hawk's head, and he worships the sun, as is the duty of a Heliopolitan genii. His right arm is uplifted, his left is pressed to his breast. The style of the whole is dry, and the granulated surface of the skin adds to the hard effect of the figure. The action, however, is energetic and correct, and the bird's head is adjusted with surprising skill to the man's neck and shoulders. The same qualities and the same faults distinguish the Horus of the Posno collection. Standing, he uplifted a libation vase, now lost, and poured the contents upon a king who once stood face to face with him. This roughness of treatment is less apparent in the other 3 Posno figures, above all in that which bears the name of Mosu engraved over the place of the heart. Like the Horus, this Mosu stands upright, his left foot advanced, and his left arm pendant. His right hand is raised as grasping the wand of office. The trunk is naked, and round his loins he wears a striped cloth with a squared end falling in front. His head is clad in a short wig covered with short curls, piled one above the other. The ear is round and large. The eyes are well opened, and were originally of silver, but have been stolen by some Arab. The features have a remarkable expression of pride and dignity. After these, what can be said for the thousands of statuettes of Osiris, of Isis, of Nephthys, of Horus, of Hephaestum, which have been found in the sands and ruins of Saqqara, Bubastis, and other cities of the Delta? Many are without doubt charming objects for glass cases, and are to be admired for perfection of casting and delicacy of execution; but the greater number are mere articles of commerce, made upon the same pattern, and perhaps in the selfsame moulds, century after century, for the delight of devotees and pilgrims. They are rounded, vulgar, destitute of originality, and have no more distinction than the thousands of coloured statuettes of saints and virgins which stock the shelves of our modern dealers in pious wares. An exception must, however, be made in favour of the images of animals, such as rams, sphinxes, and lions, which to the last retained a more pronounced stamp of individuality. The Egyptians had a special predilection for the feline race. They have represented the lion in every attitude, giving chase to the antelope, springing upon the hunter, wounded and turning to bite his wound, couchant and disdainfully calm; and no people have depicted him with a more thorough knowledge of his habits, or with so intense a vitality. Several gods and goddesses, as Shu, Anhur, Bast, Sekhet, Tefnut, have the form of the lion or of the cat; and inasmuch as the worship of these deities was more popular in the Delta than elsewhere, so there never passes a year when, from amid the ruins of Bubastis, Tanis, Mendes, or some less famous city, there is not dug up a store of little figures of lions and lionesses, or of men and women with lions' heads or cats' heads. The cats of Bubastis and the lions of Tel es Seba crowd our museums. The lions of Horbiat may be reckoned among the chefs d'oeuvre of Egyptian statuary. Upon one of the largest among them is inscribed the name of Apries. But if even this evidence were lacking, the style of the piece would compel us to attribute it to the Saïte period. It formed part of the ornamentation of a temple or naos door, and the other side was either built into a wall or embedded into a piece of wood. The lion is caught in a trap, or perhaps lying down in an oblong cage, with only his head and forefeet outside. The lines of the body are simple and full of power. The expression of the face is calm and strong. In breadth and majesty he almost equals the fine limestone lions of Amenhotep III. The idea of inlaying gold and other precious metals upon the surface of bronze, stone, or wood was already ancient in Egypt in the time of Khufu. The gold is often amalgamated with pure silver. When amalgamated to the extent of 20%, it changes its name and is called electrum, azemu. This electrum is a fine light yellow colour. It pales as the proportion of silver becomes larger, and at 60% it is nearly white. The silver came chiefly from Asia, in rings, sheets, and bricks of standard weight. The golden electrum came partly from Syria in bricks and rings, and partly from the Sudan in nuggets and gold dust. The process of refining and alloying are figured on certain monuments of the early dynasties. In a bas-relief at Saqqara we see the weighted gold entrusted to the craftsman for working. In another example (at Beni Hassan), the washing and melting down of the ore is represented; and again at Thebes, the goldsmith is depicted sitting in front of his crucible, holding the blowpipe to his lips with the left hand, and grasping his pincers with the right, thus fanning the flame, and at the same time making ready to seize the ingot. The Egyptians struck neither coins nor medals. With these exceptions, they made the same use of precious metals as we do ourselves. We gild the crosses and cupolas of our churches; they covered the doors of their temples, the lower part of their wall surfaces, certain bas-reliefs, pyramidions of obelisks, and even whole obelisks, with plates of gold. The obelisks of Queen Hatshepsut at Karnak were coated with electrum. They were visible from both banks of the Nile, and when the sun rose between them, as he came up from the heavenly horizon, they flooded the two Egypts with their dazzling rays. These plates of metal were forged with hammer and anvil. For smaller objects, they made use of little pellets beaten flat between two pieces of parchment. In the Museum of the Louvre we have a gilder's book, and the gold leaf which it contains is as thin as the gold leaf used by German goldsmiths of the past century. Gold was applied to bronze surfaces by means of an ammoniacal solvent. If the object to be gilt were a wooden statue, the workman began by sticking a piece of fine linen all over the surface, or by covering it with a very thin coat of plaster. Upon this he laid his gold or silver leaf. It is thus that wooden statues of Thoth, Horus, and Nefertum were gilded, from the time of Khufu. The temple of Isis, the Lady of the Pyramid, contained a dozen such images, and this temple was not one of the largest in the Memphite necropolis. There would seem to have been hundreds of gilded statues in the Theban temples. At all events, in the time of the victorious dynasties of the new empire, and as regards wealth, the Ptolemaic sanctuaries were in no wise inferior to those of the Theban period. Bronze and gilded wood were not always good enough for the gods of Egypt. They exacted pure gold, and their worshippers gave them as much of it as possible. Entire statues of the precious metals were dedicated by the kings of the ancient and middle empires, and the pharaohs of the 18th and 19th dynasties, who drew at will upon the treasures of Asia, transcended all that had been done by their predecessors. Even in times of decadence, the feudal lords kept up the traditions of the past, and, like Prince Mentuemhat, replaced the images of gold and silver which had been carried off from Karnak by the generals of Sardanapalus at the time of the Assyrian invasions. The quantity of metal thus consecrated to the service of the gods must have been considerable. If many figures were less than an inch in height, many others measured 3 cubits or more. Some were of gold, some were of silver, others were part gold and part silver. There were even some which combined gold with sculptured ivory, ebony, and precious stones, thus closely resembling the chryselephantine statues of the Greeks. Aided by the bas-relief subjects of Karnak, Medinet Habu, and Dendera, as well as by the statues in wood and limestone, which have come down to our day, we can tell exactly what they were like. However the material might vary, the style was always the same. Nothing is more perishable than works of this description. They are foredoomed to destruction by the mere value of the materials in which they are made. What civil war and foreign invasion had spared, and what had chanced to escape the rapacity of Roman princes and governors, fell prey to Christian iconoclasm. A few tiny statuettes, buried as amulets upon the bodies of mummies, a few domestic divinities buried in the ruins of private houses, a few ex votos, forgotten perchance in some dark corner of a fallen sanctuary, have escaped till the present day. The Ptah and Amen of Queen Ahhotep, another golden Amen also at Gizeh, and the silver vulture found in 1885 at Medinet Habu, are the only pieces of this kind which can be attributed with certainty to the great period of Egyptian art. The remainder are of Sa'ite or Ptolemaic work. They are remarkable only for the perfection with which they are wrought. The gold and silver vessels used in the service of the temples and in the houses of private persons shared the fate of the statues. At the beginning of the present century, the Louvre acquired some flat-bottomed cups, which Thothmes III presented as the reward of valour to one of his generals, named Tahuti. The silver cup is much mutilated, but the golden cup is intact and excellently designed. The upright sides are adorned with a hieroglyphic legend. A central rosette is engraved at the bottom. 6 fish are represented in the act of swimming round the rosette, and these again are surrounded by a border of lotus bells, united by a curved line. The 5 vases of Thmuis in the Gizeh Museum are of silver. They form part of the treasury of the temple, and had been buried in a hiding place, where they remained till our own day. We have no indication of their probable age, but whether they belong to the Greek or the Theban period, the workmanship is purely Egyptian. Of one vessel only the cover is left, the handle being formed of 2 flowers upon one stem. The others are perfect, and are decorated in repousse work with lotus lilies in bud and blossom. The form is simple and elegant, the ornamentation sober and delicate, the relief low. One is, however, surrounded by a row of ovoid bosses, which project in high relief and somewhat alter the shape of the body of the vase. They are interesting specimens, but they are so few in number that, were it not for the wall paintings, we should have but a very imperfect idea of the skill of Egyptian goldsmiths. The pharaohs had not our commercial resources, and could not circulate the gold and silver tribute offerings of conquered nations in the form of coin. When the gods had received their share of the booty, there was no alternative but to melt the rest down into ingots, fashion it into personal ornaments, or convert it into gold and silver plate. What was true of the kings held good also for their subjects. For the space of at least 6 or 8 centuries, dating from the time of Ahmes I, the taste for plate was carried to excess. Every good house was not only stocked with all that was needful for the service of the table, such as cups, goblets, plates, ewers, and ornamental baskets chased with figures of fantastic animals, but also with large ornamental vases, which were dressed with flowers and displayed to visitors on gala days. Some of these vases were of extraordinary richness. Here, for instance, is a crater, the handles modelled as 2 papyrus buds, and the foot as a full-blown papyrus. 2 Asiatic slaves in sumptuous garments are represented in the act of upheaving it with all their strength. Here again is a kind of hydria with a lid in the form of an inverted lotus, flanked by the heads of 2 gazelles. The heads and necks of 2 horses, bridled and fully caparisoned, stand back to back on either side of the foot of the vase. The body is divided into a series of horizontal zones, the middle zone being in the likeness of a marshland, with an antelope coursing at full speed among the reeds. Two enamelled cruets have elaborately wrought lids, one fashioned as the head of a plumed eagle, and the other as the head of the god Bes, flanked by two vipers. But foremost among them all is a golden centrepiece offered by a viceroy of Ethiopia to Amenhotep III. The design reproduces one of the most popular subjects connected with the foreign conquests of Egypt. Men and apes are seen gathering fruits in a forest of dom palms. Two natives, each with a single feather on his head and a striped kilt about his loins, lead tame giraffes with halters. Others, apparently of the same nationality, kneel with upraised hands, as if begging for quarter. Two negro prisoners, lying face downwards upon the ground, lift their heads with difficulty. A large vase, with a short foot and a lofty cone-shaped cover, stands amid the trees. The craftsmen who made this piece evidently valued elegance and beauty less than richness. They cared little for the heavy effect and bad taste of the whole, provided only that they were praised for their skill, and for the quantity of metal which they had succeeded in using. Other vases of the same type, pictured in a scene of presentations to Rameses II. In the great temple of Abu Simbel, vary the subject by showing buffaloes running in and out among the trees in place of led giraffes. These were costly playthings wrought in gold, such as the Byzantine emperors of the 9th century accumulated in their palace of Magnora, and which they exhibited on state occasions in order to impress foreigners with a profound sense of their riches and power. When a victorious pharaoh returned from a distant campaign, the vessels of gold and silver which formed part of his booty figured in the triumphal procession, together with his train of foreign captives. Vases in daily use were of slighter make, and less encumbered with inconvenient ornaments. The two leopards which serve as handles to a crater of the time of Thothmes III. Are not well proportioned, neither do they combine agreeably with the curves of the vase; but the accompanying cup and a cruet belonging to the same service are very happily conceived, and have much purity of form. These vessels of engraved and repoussé gold and silver, some representing hunting scenes and incidents of battle, were imitated by Phoenician craftsmen, and being exported to Asia Minor, Greece, and Italy, carried Egyptian patterns and subjects into different lands. The passion for precious metals was pushed to such extremes under the reigns of the Ramessides, that it was no longer enough to use them only at table. Rameses II. and Rameses III. had thrones of gold, not merely of wood plated with gold, but made of the solid metal, and set with precious stones. These things were too valuable to escape destruction, and were the first to disappear. Their artistic value, however, by no means equalled their intrinsic value, and the loss is not one for which we need to be inconsolable. Orientals, men and women alike, are great lovers of jewellery. The Egyptians were no exception to this rule. Not satisfied to adorn themselves when living with a profusion of trinkets, they loaded the arms, the fingers, the neck, the ears, the brow, and the ankles of their dead with more or less costly ornaments. The quantity thus buried in tombs was so considerable that even now, after 30 centuries of active search, we find from time to time mummies which are, so to say, cuirassed in gold. Much of this funerary jewellery was made merely for show on the day of the funeral, and betrays its purpose by the slightness of the workmanship. The favourite jewels of the deceased person were nevertheless frequently buried with him, and the style and finish of these leaves nothing to be desired. Chains and rings have come down to us in large numbers, as indeed might be expected. The ring, in fact, was not a simple ornament, but an actual necessary. Official documents were not signed, but sealed, and the seal was good in law. Every Egyptian, therefore, had his seal, which he kept about his person, ready for use if required. The poor man's seal was a simple copper or silver ring. The ring of the rich man was a more or less elaborate jewel, covered with chasing and relief work. The bezel was movable, and turned upon a pivot. It was frequently set with some kind of stone, engraved with the owner's emblem or device, as, for example, a scorpion, a lion, a hawk, or a cynocephalous ape. As, in the eyes of her husband, his ring was the one essential ornament, so was her necklace in the estimation of the Egyptian lady. I have seen a chain in silver which measured 63 inches in length. Others, on the contrary, do not exceed 2 or 2½ inches. They are of all sizes and patterns, some consisting of 2 or 3 twists, some of large links, some of small links, some massive and heavy, others as light and flexible as the finest Venetian filigree. The humblest peasant girl, as well as the lady of the highest rank, might have her necklet, and the woman must be poor indeed whose little store comprised no other ornament. No mere catalogue of bracelets, diadems, collarets, or insignia of nobility could give an idea of the number and variety of jewels known to us by pictured representations or existing specimens. Pectorals of gold cloisonne work, inlaid with vitreous paste or precious stones, and which bear the cartouches of Amenemhat II., Usertesen II., and Usertesen III., exhibit a marvellous precision of taste, lightness of touch, and dexterity of fine workmanship. So fresh and delicate are they, that we forget the royal ladies to whom they belonged have been dead, and their bodies stiffened and disfigured into mummies, for nearly 5,000 years. At Berlin may be seen the parvus of an Ethiopian Candace. At the Louvre we have the jewels of Prince Sa. At Gizeh are preserved the ornaments of Queen Aahhotep. Aahhotep was the wife of Kamez, a king of the 17th dynasty, and she was probably the mother of Ahmes I, first king of the 18th dynasty. Her mummy had been stolen by one of the robber bands which infested the Theban necropolis towards the close of the 20th dynasty. They buried the royal corpse till such time as they might have leisure to despoil it in safety, and they were most likely seized and executed before they could carry that pretty little project into effect. The secret hiding place perished with them, till discovered in 1860 by some Arab diggers. Most of the objects which this queen took with her into the next world were exclusively women's gear, as a fan handle plated with gold, a bronze-gilt mirror mounted upon an ebony handle enriched with a lotus in chased gold. Her bracelets are of various types. Some are anklets and armlets, and consist merely of plain gold rings, both solid and hollow, bordered with plated chainwork in imitation of filigree. Others are for wearing on the wrist, like the bracelets of modern ladies, and are made of small beads of gold, lapis lazuli, carnelian, and green felspar. These are strung on gold wire in a checker pattern, each square divided diagonally in halves of different colours. 2 gold plates, very lightly engraved, with the cartouches of Ahmes I, are connected by means of a gold pin, and form the fastening. A fine bracelet in the form of 2 semicircles joined by a hinge also bears the name of Ahmes I. The make of this jewel reminds us of Cloisonne enamels. Ahmes kneels in the presence of the god Seb and his acolytes, the genii of Sop and Khonu. The figures and hieroglyphs are cut out in solid gold, delicately engraved with the burin, and stand in relief upon a ground surface filled in with pieces of blue paste and lapis lazuli artistically cut. A bracelet of more complicated workmanship, though of inferior execution, was found on the wrist of the queen. It is of massive gold, and consists of 3 parallel bands set with turquoises. On the front a vulture is represented with outspread wings, the feathers composed of green enamel, lapis lazuli, and carnelian, set in cloisons of gold. The hair of the mummy was drawn through a massive gold diadem, scarcely as large as a bracelet. The name of Ahmes is encrusted in blue paste upon an oblong plaque in the centre, flanked at each side by 2 little sphinxes, which seem as if in the act of keeping watch over the inscription. Round her neck was a large flexible gold chain, finished at each end by a goose's head reversed. These heads could be linked one to the other when the chain needed to be fastened. The scarabaeus pendant to this chain is encrusted upon the shoulder, and wing sheaths with blue glass paste rayed with gold, the legs and body being in massive gold. The royal paru was completed by a large collar of the kind known as the useke. It is finished at each end with a golden hawk's head inlaid with blue enamel, and consists of rows of scrolls, 4-petalled florets, hawks, vultures, winged uraei, crouching jackals, and figures of antelopes pursued by tigers. The whole of these ornaments are of gold ripazi work, and they were sewn upon the royal winding sheet by means of a small ring soldered to the back of each. Upon the breast, below this collar, hung a square jewel of the kind known as pectoral ornaments. The general form is that of a naos or shrine. Ahmes stands upright in a papyrus bark between Amen and Ra, who pour the water of purification upon his head and body. 2 hawks hover to the right and left of the king, above the heads of the gods. The figures are outlined in cloisons of gold, and these were filled in with little plaques of precious stones and enamel, many of which have fallen out. The effect of this piece is somewhat heavy, and if considered apart from the rest of the paru, its purpose might seem somewhat obscure. In order to form a correct judgment, we have, however, to remember in what fashion the women of ancient Egypt were clad. They wore a kind of smock of semi-transparent material, which came very little higher than the waist. The chest and bosom, neck and shoulders were bare, and the one garment was kept in place only by a slender pair of braces. The rich clothed these uncovered parts with jewellery. The Useka collar half hid the shoulders and chest. The pectoral masked the hollow between the breasts. Sometimes even the breasts were covered with two golden cups, either painted or enamelled. Besides the jewels found upon the mummy of Queen Amenhotep, a number of arms and amulets were heaped inside her coffin, namely 3 massive gold flies hanging from a slender chain, 9 small hatchets, 3 of gold and 6 of silver, a golden lion's head of very minute workmanship, a wooden sceptre set in gold spirals, 2 anklets, and 2 poignards. One of these poignards has a golden sheath and a wooden hilt inlaid with triangular mosaics of carnelian, lapis lazuli, felspar, and gold. 4 female heads in gold repoussé form the pommel, and a bull's head reversed covers the junction of blade and hilt. The edges of the blade are of massive gold, the centre of black bronze damascened with gold. On one side is the solar cartouche of Ahmes, below which a lion pursues a bull, the remaining space being filled in with 4 grasshoppers in a row. On the other side we have the family name of Ahmes, and a series of full-blown flowers, issuing one from another and diminishing towards the point. A poignard found at Mycenae by Dr. Schillermann is similarly decorated. The Phoenicians, who were industrious copyists of Egyptian models, probably introduced this pattern into Greece. The second poignard is of a make not uncommon to this day in Persia and India. The blade is of a yellowish bronze, fixed into a disc-shaped hilt of silver. When wielded, this lenticular disc fits to the hollow of the hand, the blade coming between the first and second fingers. Of what use, it may be asked, were all these weapons to a woman, and a dead woman? To this we may reply that the other world was peopled with foes. Typhonian genii, serpents, gigantic scorpions, tortoises, monsters of every description, against which it was incessantly needful to do battle. The poignards placed inside the coffin for the self-defence of the soul were useful only for fighting at close quarters. Certain weapons of a projectile kind were therefore added, such as bows and arrows, boomerangs made of hard wood, and a battle axe. The handle of this axe is fashioned of cedar wood covered with sheet gold. The legend of Ahmes is inlaid thereon in characters of lapis lazuli, carnelian, turquoise, and green felspar. The blade is fixed in a cleft of the wood, and held in place by a platework of gold wire. It is of black bronze, formerly gilt. On one side it is ornamental with lotus flowers upon a gold ground. On the other, Ahmes is represented in the act of slaying a barbarian, whom he grasps by the hair of the head. Beneath this group, Mentu, the Egyptian war god, is symbolized by a griffin with the head of an eagle. In addition to all these objects, there were 2 small boats, one in gold and one in silver, emblematic of the bark in which the mummy must cross the river to her last home, and of that other bark in which she would ultimately navigate the waters of the West, in company with the immortal gods. When found, the silver boat rested upon a wooden truck with 4 bronze wheels, but as it was in a very dilapidated state, it has been dismounted and replaced by the golden boat. The hull is long and slight, the prow and stem are elevated, and terminate in gracefully curved papyrus blossoms. 2 little platforms, surrounded by balustrades on a panelled ground, are at the prow and on the poop, like quarter-decks. The pilot stands upon the one, and the steersman before the other, with a large oar in his hand. This oar takes the place of the modern helm. 12 boatmen in solid silver are rowing under the orders of these 2 officers, Khamis himself being seated in the centre, hatchet and sceptre in hand. Such were some of the objects buried with one single mummy, and I have, even now, enumerated only the most remarkable among them. The technical processes throughout are irreproachable, and the correct taste of the craftsman is in no wise inferior to his dexterity of hand. Having arrived at the perfection displayed at the Piru of Amenhotep, the goldsmith's art did not long maintain so high a level. The fashions changed, and jewellery became heavier in design. The ring of Rameses II, with his horses standing upon the bezel, and the bracelet of Prince Sa, with its griffins and lotus flowers in cloisonné enamel, both in the Louvre, are less happily conceived than the bracelets of Ahmes. The craftsmen who made these ornaments were doubtless as skilful as the craftsmen of the time of Queen Amenhotep, but they had less taste and less invention. Rameses II was condemned either to forego the pleasures of wearing his ring, or to see his little horses damaged and broken off by the least accident. Already noticeable in the time of the 19th dynasty, this decadence becomes more marked as we approach the Christian era. The earrings of Rameses IX. In the Gizeh Museum are an ungraceful assemblage of filigree discs, short chains, and pendant uraei, such as no human ear could have carried without being torn or pulled out of shape. They were attached to each side of the wig upon the head of the mummy. The bracelets of the high priest Pinatum III. Found upon his mummy are mere round rings of gold encrusted with pieces of coloured glass and carnelian, like those still made by the Sudanese blacks. The Greek invasion began by modifying the style of Egyptian gold work, and ended by gradually substituting Greek types for native types. The jewels of an Ethiopian queen, purchased from Ferlini by the Berlin Museum, contain not only some ornaments which might readily have been attributed to Pharaonic times, but others of a mixed style in which Hellenic influences are distinctly traceable. The treasure discovered at Zagazig in 1878, at Kenna in 1881, and at Dahmanur in 1882, consisted of objects having nothing whatever in common with Egyptian traditions. They comprise hairpins supporting statuettes of Venus, zone buckles, agrafes for fastening the peplum, rings and bracelets set with cameos, and caskets ornamented at the four corners with little Ionic columns. The old patterns, however, were still in request in remote provincial places, and village goldsmiths adhered indifferent well to the antique traditions of their craft. Their city brethren had meanwhile no skill to do aught but make clumsy copies of Greek and Roman originals. In this rapid sketch of the industrial arts there are many lacunae. When referring to examples, I have perforce limited myself to such as are contained in the best known collections. How many more might not be discovered if one had the leisure to visit provincial museums, and trace what the hazard of sales may have dispersed through private collections. The variety of small monuments due to the industry of ancient Egypt is infinite, and a methodical study of those monuments has yet to be made. It is a task which promises many surprises to whomsoever shall undertake it. End of Chapter 5. Recording by Timothy Ferguson, Gold Coast, Australia. End of Manual of Egyptian Archaeology and Guide to the Study of Antiquities in Egypt by Gaston Maspero. Translated by Amelia B. Edwards.